My mother looked at me on the day I was celebrating my biggest achievement. She shoved me out of the family photograph so my younger sister could be the center of attention. She pointed at me saying, "At least she is smart because beauty skipped her." Everyone laughed. My father looked at the ground. They treated me like a stain on our perfect image. I did not cry. I packed a bag, grabbed my $537 in tips, and walked into the dark. 14 years later, I walked into my sister's lavish wedding, and her wealthy groom asked the one question that destroyed her entire life in front of everyone. The Atlanta afternoon heat felt suffocating, but the atmosphere inside our house was colder. I was 22 in my graduation gown. It was supposed to be a day of triumph. I worked double shifts at a diner to pay for classes while my parents funneled every spare dollar into pageant dresses for my 15-year-old sister Jasmine. I thought earning my degree would make my mother proud. I was foolish. Valerie, my mother, was obsessed with appearances. Status and beauty were the only currencies that mattered. Jasmine was her golden child, the flawless reflection of her own vanity. I was the dark-skinned, short-haired outcast who preferred coding manuals over cosmetics. We gathered in the living room for my celebration. Instead, Valerie turned it into a photo shoot for Jasmine, who wore a custom dress costing more than my entire tuition. I stepped into the frame hoping to get one picture in my cap and gown. Valerie dropped her camera and sighed. She marched over and shoved me hard by the shoulder, pushing me completely out of the frame. "Step aside, Aaliyah," she snapped, her voice echoing through the room. "Your face is ruining the lighting." I stumbled backward, clutching my hard-earned diploma. The relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one tried to stop her. Valerie turned to the crowd with a theatrical laugh. "Let us be honest here," she announced, ensuring everyone could hear. "At least she has her books because beauty definitely skipped her. We have to focus the camera on Jasmine if we want a picture worth framing." The room erupted in laughter. Aunts and uncles chuckled at my expense. I looked over at Jasmine expecting a shred of sisterly defense, but she was just posing, soaking up the attention with a smug grin. Desperate, I locked eyes with my father, David. He stood by the doorway holding a drink. He saw the humiliation burning in my eyes. Instead of defending me, he simply turned his head and stared at the floor. His cowardice hurt worse than her cruelty. It confirmed what I secretly knew. I was entirely alone in this house. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not yell at my mother or beg my father to act like a man. I just took off my cap and placed it on the dining table. I walked up the stairs to my small bedroom. The room was bare, holding only the absolute necessities. I pulled an old duffel bag from the closet and packed what I needed to survive. A few clothes, my worn-out laptop, and my notebooks. I reached under my mattress and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was exactly $537. It was every single tip I saved from waitressing last month. That stack of bills was my safety net. It felt like a fortune because it represented my ticket to freedom. I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked back down the stairs. The party was going strong in the living room. I could hear my mother bragging about Jasmine's auditions. They had already forgotten about me. I walked straight out the front door and stepped into the humid Atlanta night. I did not look back at the large brick house that never felt like a home. I walked 3 miles to the bus station. With every step, I made a silent vow. I would build an empire so massive their opinions, laughter and existence would never matter again. I would become untouchable. 14 years passed since that night. I traded the heat for the crisp winds of Chicago. I did not just survive, I conquered. Sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the skyline, I watched the city lights flicker to life. The glass walls reflected a woman who had completely transformed. I was 36 now. I wore a sharp, tailored designer suit that commanded respect in any boardroom. My hair was styled in a sleek, fierce buzz cut, a deliberate rejection of the beauty standards my mother tried to force upon me. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Digital, an industry-leading technology firm specializing in user interface design and three-dimensional modeling. I built a $40 million empire entirely on my own. The silence of my office broke when my assistant knocked gently on the heavy oak door. She walked in and placed an envelope on my desk. It was sealed with a gold wax stamp. I sliced it open. Inside was a lavish wedding invitation. Jasmine was getting married to Connor, a wealthy venture capitalist and heir to a massive Chicago investment fund. Jasmine finally achieved my mother's dream, securing a rich white husband from the financial elite. It was not the invitation that caught my attention. A yellow sticky note fluttered out and landed on my desk. I recognized my mother's harsh handwriting immediately. Jasmine is marrying into Chicago elite, the note read. Do not show up and embarrass us with your cheap presents. Stay away. I read the words twice, feeling a cold smile stretch across my face. They still thought I was the broke, struggling outcast they discarded 14 years ago. They had no idea that Apex Digital, the company they never bothered to look up, had just been retained to conduct a massive system audit for Connor's family investment fund. I picked up the note and dropped it into the shredder, watching the blades destroy my mother's toxic words. I pressed the intercom, connecting to my assistant. Cancel my weekend meetings. I instructed, my voice calm and sharp. Have the flight crew prepare the private jet. I am going to a wedding to get my revenge. The flight from my corporate headquarters in Chicago to the luxury resort took less than an hour, but the shift in reality was monumental. My private jet touched down on the private airstrip just outside the city limits. A sleek black town car was already waiting on the tarmac. I slid into the leather back seat, opening my tablet to review the security protocols my team was actively auditing for the massive investment fund. The ultra-luxurious resort, where the wedding weekend was taking place, loomed ahead like a fortress of glass and steel. It was known exclusively as the playground for the absolute wealthiest families in the Midwest. I stepped out of the vehicle the exact moment the chauffeur opened my door. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored designer suit in deep crimson. It was cut perfectly to my frame, projecting pure, unadulterated power. My boots clicked against the polished marble steps of the grand entrance. The bellhop immediately rushed forward to take my single leather overnight bag, bowing his head respectfully. I did not look like the scared dropout my family remembered from 14 years ago. I looked like the woman who owned the ground they were standing on. The main lobby of the resort was a massive expanse of gold accents and crystal chandeliers. I walked toward the front desk, my eyes scanning the lavish environment. The peaceful atmosphere of the luxury hotel was violently interrupted by a shrill, familiar voice echoing near the reception counter. I stopped walking immediately. Standing near the marble desk were two women causing a massive, humiliating scene. It was my mother Valerie and my younger sister Jasmine. Jasmine was throwing her hands in the air, wearing an overly embellished white bridal sweatsuit that screamed absolute desperation. Valerie was leaning aggressively over the reception counter, waving a piece of plastic directly in the face of a highly uncomfortable concierge. I stepped behind a large decorative pillar, observing the chaos unfolding before me. Valerie was practically screaming at the poor hotel employee, demanding an immediate upgrade to the prestigious bridal suite. The concierge kept his voice low and professional, explaining repeatedly that the credit card on file had been completely declined by the bank. He politely asked if she had another form of payment to cover the massive incidental hold required for the luxury room upgrade. Jasmine stomped her foot on the expensive marble floor like a spoiled toddler. She began whining loudly about how her future in-laws would be arriving soon, and she desperately needed the best room in the entire building for her bridal preparation photographs. Valerie slammed her fist on the counter, demanding to speak to the general manager right that second. She loudly proclaimed that her daughter was marrying into the most powerful venture capital family in Chicago, and that the hotel was making a catastrophic mistake by disrespecting them. The concierge typed nervously on his computer keyboard, apologizing, but stating firmly that the booking system would not authorize the room key cards without a valid payment method. I watched my mother frantically dig through her designer handbag, which I instantly recognized as a cheap counterfeit copy from miles away. She pulled out 3 different credit cards, slamming them onto the marble counter one by one. The concierge swiped the first card through the machine. The terminal beeped and showed declined. He swiped the second card. The machine beeped again and showed declined. The third card met the exact same humiliating fate. Jasmine covered her face, groaning about how embarrassing this whole financial ordeal was. They were standing in the middle of a five-star resort, completely broke and desperately trying to maintain a crumbling facade of generational wealth. It was a pathetic display of the exact toxic vanity that had driven me away 14 years ago. They had not changed at all in over a decade. They just found new, desperate ways to fund their ongoing delusions. I stepped out from behind the decorative pillar and walked slowly toward the reception desk. My crimson suit caught the ambient light as I moved with deliberate, measured steps. The sharp, heavy click of my boots on the marble floor drew the attention of the surrounding guests, and eventually my family. Valerie turned her head to see who was approaching them. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer shock. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Jasmine turned around, following the panicked gaze of our mother. Her jaw dropped open in disbelief. For a split second, they did not even recognize me. They were looking for a broken, defeated girl who ran away with nothing. Instead, they saw a powerful executive radiating total dominance and extreme wealth. When the realization finally hit them, the shock Valerie felt instantly morphed into twisted, ugly rage. She abandoned the poor concierge and marched aggressively across the hotel lobby directly toward me. Her face was contorted with pure malice and hatred. She did not care that we were standing in a public luxury space surrounded by wealthy strangers. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging sharply into the expensive fabric of my custom sleeve. "I told you not to come," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me to hear. "What are you doing here in this place? You are trying to ruin the luxury aesthetic of this wedding with your cheap presents. You have absolutely no right to be in a place like this." Jasmine hurried over, standing right behind our mother, crossing her arms defensively to block me. She glared at me, looking me up and down with obvious deep disdain. "You need to leave right now," Jasmine demanded, looking around nervously. "This is a private resort for elite guests, not a charity shelter for college dropouts. If the wealthy family of her fiancé sees you, they will think we associate with absolute trash. I am going to call hotel security and have you dragged out of here if you do not turn around and walk out those doors right this second." They stood there, fully believing they held all the power in this dynamic. They truly believed their fake designer clothes and their impending marriage into wealth gave them the unearned authority to treat me like dirt on their shoes. They were entirely oblivious to the harsh reality of the situation. They did not know that my company, Apex Digital, had recently secured a massive corporate contract to upgrade the cybersecurity infrastructure for this exact luxury hotel chain. They did not know that the executive board of directors considered me a primary strategic partner and a highly valued guest. They thought I was a poor relative crashing their fake luxury parade. I did not flinch or pull away. I did not raise my voice or react to their desperate, unhinged hostility. I simply looked down at the shaking hand of Valerie, tightly gripping my expensive designer sleeve. My expression was colder than ice and completely unbothered. I slowly lifted my gaze and locked eyes directly with my toxic mother. "Let go of me before I buy this hotel and have you evicted," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. Valerie's grip faltered slightly, but she did not let go of my sleeve immediately. She scoffed loudly, her voice echoing against the high ceilings of the lobby, telling me I was completely bluffing and making a fool of myself. Jasmine crossed her arms over her embellished white tracksuit and started actively yelling for hotel security to intervene. She pointed her finger, demanding that someone come and remove the trash from her sight before her wealthy future-in-laws arrived. The loud, escalating commotion finally caught the direct attention of the highest authority in the building. The general manager of the luxury resort, a distinguished older man dressed in a pristine tailored tuxedo, rushed over with two burly security guards flanking him closely. Jasmine stepped forward immediately, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. She demanded the manager remove me from the premises without delay, claiming I was a deranged stalker who had sneaked in to ruin her elite high society wedding. Valerie chimed in loudly, adding that I was a homeless, estranged relative who had probably come to beg for money from her daughter's wealthy future son-in-law. She insisted that I was a major security threat to the other elite guests staying at the resort. The manager did not even look at them. He stopped dead in his tracks the exact moment he recognized my face. The sheer panic and absolute profound respect washed over his features instantly. He waved the security guards away with a sharp, frantic flick of his wrist. He completely ignored my screaming mother and my demanding, entitled sister. Instead, he stepped forward and bowed his head deeply in my direction. "Welcome back, Ms. Aaliyah," he said, his voice ringing with profound professional reverence. "We are incredibly honored to have you staying with us this weekend. Your presidential penthouse is fully prepared and waiting for you on the top floor." The entire lobby went completely silent. The wealthy guests who had been watching the drama unfold suddenly realized who held the actual power in this dynamic. The manager gestured respectfully toward the exclusive gold elevator reserved only for ultimate high rollers and VIP guests. He continued speaking, ensuring every single word landed heavily in the quiet space. "The executive board wanted me to personally thank you for upgrading our hotel chain's entire global software infrastructure. Your company saved us millions in security breaches last quarter alone. If there is absolutely anything you need during your stay, please consider it already done. We have stocked the penthouse with your preferred vintage of champagne just as your assistant requested." Valerie slowly dropped her hand from my crimson designer sleeve, as if she had just touched a burning hot stove. Her jaw practically hit the polished marble floor. She looked frantically from the bowing manager to my custom-tailored suit, and finally to the gold elevator keycard the manager was actively extending toward my hand. The harsh reality of my massive wealth and undeniable status hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The impoverished college dropout she thought she was brutally bullying was actually the tech mogul securing the very luxury establishment she was so desperately trying to impress. Jasmine stood frozen in her tacky bridal outfit, her eyes wide with total confusion and rapidly brewing envy. The gears in Valerie's head spun frantically as she attempted to salvage the humiliating situation she had just created. The vicious, aggressive scowl on her face instantly melted away, replaced by a sickeningly sweet artificial smile that made my skin crawl. She smoothed down the front of her cheap counterfeit dress and took a deliberate step closer to me. "Aaliyah, sweetheart," she purred, her tone suddenly dripping with fake maternal affection. "You should have told us you were doing so well for yourself. We are just so incredibly proud of you. Look at how beautiful and successful you have become." Jasmine caught on to the desperate pivot immediately. She dropped her hostile defensive posture and tried to look like a stressed but loving bride who was simply overwhelmed by wedding planning. Valerie reached out, attempting to touch my arm again, but this time with gentle, calculated familiarity. I easily stepped back, avoiding her grasp entirely. "Since you have that massive penthouse upstairs," Valerie continued, her voice rising, so the manager and the surrounding guests could clearly hear her, "it only makes sense that you let your baby sister use it for the weekend. The bridal we originally booked is simply not accommodating enough for her extensive needs, and her wealthy future in-laws expect nothing but the absolute best from our family. You can just take a standard room and let Jasmine have the penthouse for her bridal preparations and photographs. It is the absolute least you can do for your own flesh and blood after being away for so long. Family has to stick together and support each other during these important milestones." I looked at both of them standing there, steeped in absolute audacity and breathtaking entitlement. They had literally spent the last 10 minutes degrading me in a public lobby, calling me cheap and demanding my eviction, and now they had the sheer, unadulterated nerve to demand the keys to my luxury suite. They expected me to simply hand over the best room in the hotel just because they shared my DNA. I slowly took the gold keycard from the manager, slipping it smoothly into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I turned my attention back to Valerie, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet reception area, ensuring the concierge and the security guards heard every syllable. "The presidential penthouse is reserved exclusively for paying guests," Valerie, I stated coldly, maintaining intense eye contact. "It is definitely not a charity shelter for people with declined credit cards." The concierge standing behind the marble desk visibly suppressed a smile, quickly looking down at his computer monitor. Valerie gasped loudly, placing a hand over her chest, as if I had physically wounded her right there in the lobby. Jasmine turned bright red, her embarrassment returning with full forceful vengeance as she realized everyone in the vicinity had just heard about their financial struggles. I did not give them another second of my valuable time. I turned my back on them and walked directly toward the exclusive gold elevator. The rhythmic clicking of my boots on the marble floor was the only sound echoing in the tense lobby. The two burly security guards immediately stepped aside, creating a clear, respectful path for me. I stepped into the luxurious elevator cabin and pressed the glowing button for the top floor. As the heavy brass doors began to slowly close, I watched the furious, devastated expressions on the faces of my mother and sister. They were left stranded in the middle of the lobby, still possessing absolutely nothing but their fake designer bags and their shattered pride. The doors sealed shut, leaving me in total peaceful silence as the elevator smoothly ascended. I pulled my secure encrypted tablet from my leather overnight bag. If Jasmine was so desperate to project wealth while her mother's credit cards were bouncing across the city, there had to be a deeper financial fracture hiding beneath their perfect facade. I opened a backdoor access node into the public financial records linked to the Illinois Corporate Registry. I quickly located the limited liability company registered under my sister's name. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard as I bypassed the basic security encryptions and pulled up her current balance sheets and credit reports. I scanned the overwhelming rows of red numbers and discovered a massive, frantic debt hole. Jasmine was actively drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of commercial debt. The collection notices were actively piling up, and her accounts were on the verge of total collapse. She was not a wealthy bride, she was a financial ticking time bomb. The rehearsal dinner was held in the grand ballroom of the resort. It was a masterclass in quiet old money wealth and extreme privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of tables draped in heavy white linen. Tall, expensive centerpieces of white orchids and imported roses filled the entire room with a rich, heavy floral scent. The soft murmur of classical music played from a live string quartet positioned carefully in the corner of the room. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided silently across the thick carpet, carrying silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. I stood alone at the grand double doors, taking in the opulent scene before me. Connor and his family occupied the massive head table at the far end of the room. They exuded that effortless casual arrogance that comes exclusively from generations of untouchable wealth. The men wore perfectly tailored suits that did not need flashy designer labels to prove their massive cost. The women wore understated diamond jewelry that could probably buy a small private island. And sitting right in the middle of all this generational wealth was my sister Jasmine. She was wearing a high-necked, modest white silk dress. She was deliberately playing the role of the perfect, demure, and innocent bride to absolute perfection. She was smiling shyly at something Connor whispered into her ear, acting like a sweet, naive girl who had never seen a bank collection notice or a maxed-out credit card in her entire life. It was a genuinely award-winning performance of pure deception. I stepped further into the ballroom. My custom-tailored crimson suit was a sharp, aggressive contrast to the sea of muted pastels and conservative gray suits filling the room. I did not try to blend in with the crowd. I wanted them to see me. I walked slowly, letting the heavy oak doors click shut behind me. It took exactly 40 seconds for Jasmine to notice my presence in the room. I watched her gaze casually sweep across the back of the ballroom before locking directly onto my face. The physical transformation was instantaneous and incredibly beautiful to witness. The fake, modest smile completely evaporated from her face in a fraction of a second. The color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost beneath her heavy layers of expensive bridal makeup. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She visibly stopped breathing. She quickly looked over at Connor to ensure he was looking the other way, engaged in a deep conversation with his brother. Then her eyes darted frantically around the massive room until she located our mother. Valerie was standing near a towering champagne fountain, trying desperately to impress a group of wealthy older women covered in pearls. Jasmine caught Valerie by the eye and gave a sharp, panicked jerk of her head in my direction. Valerie turned her head and saw me standing there near the entrance. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. She quickly excused herself from the group of wealthy socialites, flashing them a tight fake smile before power walking across the thick ballroom carpet. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy, trying to intercept me before I could take another step toward the main dining area. She practically threw her body into my path, physically blocking my view of the head table. She instinctively reached out and grabbed my arm, but quickly let go, remembering the severe threat I had made in the hotel lobby earlier that afternoon. Her face was flushed with hot anger and sheer panic. She leaned in extremely close, forcing a wide, terrifying smile for the benefit of any wedding guests who might be watching our interaction from afar. Her voice, however, was a vicious, hissing whisper right next to my ear. "What is wrong with you?" Valerie demanded through gritted teeth, her chest heaving with anxiety. "I told you to stay away from us. This is a private rehearsal dinner for the wedding party and the groom's elite family. You are completely ruining the atmosphere with your presence." I looked down at her, observing the nervous sweat forming on her forehead. "I am a guest of the hotel, Valerie," I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And I am simply taking a walk through the event spaces. It is a beautiful setup. Who paid for all these imported orchids?" Valerie stepped closer, trying to physically box me into the corner by the heavy wooden doors. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, her breath warm and shaky with fear. "Connor and his family do not know who you really are. They do not know about your little computer business or your money. They think you are a deeply troubled woman. Jasmine had to explain your absence somehow without looking bad to her new wealthy family. So she told them you are a drug addict." I paused, letting her words sink in completely. A drug addict. The sheer audacity and malice of the lie was breathtaking. Valerie continued, her eyes darting around the room to make sure no one was listening to our conversation. "Yes, a drug addict," she repeated firmly. "Connor's family thinks you are currently locked away in a high-security rehabilitation center in California. Jasmine told them you stole her college savings to feed your addictions, and that we had to cut you off out of tough love to protect the family. They feel incredibly sorry for Jasmine. They think she is a brave, resilient survivor for overcoming the severe trauma you caused our family. If you walk over there and speak to them, I will call the security guards right now. I will tell them you escaped from your facility and that you are trespassing on private property. I will scream that you are high and dangerous and ruin your reputation in front of everyone. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right this second." I stood perfectly still, processing the immense magnitude of their deception. They had not just erased me from their lives when I left with nothing. They had actively transformed my memory into a convenient tragedy to harvest sympathy from a billionaire family. They used my absence to paint Jasmine as a noble victim. They fabricated a horrific addiction and accused me of theft just to explain why the sister of the bride was not standing at the altar. It was pure evil. It was highly calculated. It was the exact reason why showing them absolutely no mercy was the only correct path forward. I looked at my mother. I looked at the desperate fear swimming in her eyes. She actually believed her threat would work on me. She actually thought the disgusting lie she and Jasmine had spun would be enough to intimidate me into walking away quietly in shame. She thought I would be too embarrassed by the false accusation to defend myself in front of strangers. I smiled. It was a slow, chilling smile that made Valerie physically step back in fear. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her. I did not defend my character or demand an apology for the monstrous lie they had told Connor and his parents. Arguing with a desperate liar is a complete waste of valuable energy. Instead, I simply stepped around her. Valerie gasped, reaching out to stop me again, but she was entirely too slow. I bypassed her entirely, leaving her standing frozen and helpless by the heavy oak doors. I adjusted the lapels of my crimson-tailored jacket and began walking straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. I walked with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who held the entire room in the palm of her hand. I did not look at the floral arrangements or the crystal chandeliers. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. I walked directly toward the head table where Jasmine was sitting frozen in absolute terror right next to Connor's father, the billionaire fund manager who was currently paying my company millions to audit his entire financial empire. Harrison stopped mid-sentence when he caught sight of my crimson suit approaching his exclusive table. The billionaire patriarch of the Chicago investment world pushed his heavy mahogany chair back against the thick carpet. He stood up with an energy that commanded the immediate attention of every single wealthy guest seated around him. Jasmine physically recoiled when her future father-in-law rose to his feet. She pressed her back hard against the upholstered chair, looking like a trapped animal desperate for an escape route that simply did not exist. Harrison walked around the long table, completely ignoring the elite socialites who were trying to catch his eye. He extended his right hand toward me with a wide, beaming smile that radiated pure professional respect. I accepted his handshake, meeting his enthusiastic greeting with a calm, measured nod. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person, Ms. Aliyah," he announced, his deep voice carrying easily over the soft classical music playing in the background. He turned back to face the entire head table, gesturing toward me with open admiration. "I want everyone to meet the absolute tech genius who is currently auditing our entire global portfolio." He looked directly at Connor and the rest of his elite family, ensuring they understood the magnitude of my presence. This woman and her brilliant team at Apex Digital just identified a massive vulnerability in our offshore accounts, saving us more money in 1 week than most people see in a lifetime. The incredibly wealthy guests seated at the table murmured in impressed agreement, raising their champagne flutes in my direction. I watched the blood completely drain from Jasmine's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified shell. She was staring at Harrison in absolute disbelief, unable to comprehend how the sister she had just labeled a homeless drug addict was currently being praised as a savior by the most powerful man she knew. Valerie finally arrived at the edge of the head table, completely breathless from speed, walking across the ballroom to intercept me. My mother stopped dead in her tracks the exact moment she heard Harrison declare me a highly valued asset to his family empire. The aggressive hostility that had been fueling Valerie instantly vanished, replaced by a sickening, overwhelming wave of pure paralysis. She stood frozen behind an empty chair, clutching her cheap counterfeit handbag, realizing she was entirely trapped in a nightmare of her own making. They could not call hotel security to throw me out. They could not scream that I was a trespassing addict without looking like completely unhinged lunatics in front of the billionaire host who had just publicly validated my elite status. Harrison pulled out of the empty chair located directly across the table from where Jasmine was sitting. He insisted that I join them for the remainder of the rehearsal dinner, stating that his financial partners would be absolutely thrilled to speak with me about cybersecurity trends. I smoothed the fabric of my custom-tailored jacket and sat down gracefully. The trap was now fully set, and the psychological torture was ready to begin. I did not say a single word to my younger sister. I simply rested my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and locked my eyes directly onto her pale, sweating face. The waitstaff moved silently around us, placing plates of expensive seared scallops in front of the guests. I picked up my silver fork and took a slow, deliberate bite, never once breaking my intense, silent eye contact with Jasmine. The tension radiating between us was a heavy, suffocating weight. Jasmine picked up her own fork, but her hands were trembling so violently that the silver utensil clattered loudly against her china plate. She quickly dropped her hands to her lap, hiding them beneath the heavy linen napkin to conceal her absolute panic. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing nervously as she tried to maintain her demure bridal facade in front of her future in-laws. Every single time she tried to look away from me, I would simply tilt my head slightly, drawing her terrified gaze right back to my cold, unbothered expression. Valerie was forced to take a seat at an adjacent table, unable to intervene or protect her precious golden child from the silent execution happening right in front of her. I watched my mother out of the corner of my eye as she sat stiffly staring at the back of my head with a mixture of sheer hatred and profound panic. She was entirely powerless to stop the slow, methodical dismantling of their fake high society narrative. I let the silence marinate, stretching the unbearable tension until it felt like the entire room was closing in on my sister. She knew that I held the absolute power to destroy her entire life with one simple sentence. She knew that I had overheard the horrific lies she told about me stealing her college fund to feed a fabricated addiction. The sheer weight of her own monumental deception was physically crushing her right there at the dinner table. As the main course was being cleared away, Connor finally turned his full, undivided attention toward my side of the table. Up until this point, the groom had been engaged in polite conversation with his relatives, but the undeniable radiating distress coming from his bride had clearly caught his notice. Connor was a highly principled man who valued honesty and transparency above everything else. He wore a tailored navy tuxedo and possessed a calm, analytical demeanor that made him highly successful in the venture capital world. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the edge of the table, and looked at me with polite curiosity. He had obviously noticed the intense, unrelenting way I had been observing his future wife throughout the entire meal. He extended his hand across the table and introduced himself properly, thanking me for the incredible work my firm was doing to protect his family legacy. I shook his hand, acknowledging his polite greeting with a professional smile. Connor then glanced over at Jasmine, who looked like she was about to pass out from pure, unadulterated terror. He looked back at me and mentioned that I seemed very focused on his lovely bride. He asked in a friendly, conversational tone how exactly I knew Jasmine, and if we had crossed paths in the corporate world before tonight. He was completely unaware that he was speaking to the very sister his bride had just viciously slandered. I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face as I looked directly into Jasmine's panicked, tear-filled eyes. I told him that Jasmine and I go way back. The silence that followed my statement was thick and heavy. Jasmine let out a small, barely audible gasp that sounded like a dying breath. She gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white against her dark skin. She was silently begging me with her wide, terrified eyes to keep her massive secret hidden from the man she desperately wanted to marry. She looked like a convicted prisoner waiting for the executioner to drop the final blade. I let the silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds, allowing the heavy implication of my statement to settle deeply over the dining arrangement. Harrison leaned in, looking fascinated by the interaction, assuming we shared some sort of elite business history that he was unaware of. Connor smiled politely, clearly waiting for me to explain how a brilliant tech chief executive officer knew his sweet, innocent bride. I kept my voice smooth and highly calculated, ensuring that every single syllable carried the weight of a loaded weapon pointed directly at her heart. I told Connor that we shared a very long and complicated history that involved a lot of shared experiences in our younger years. I mentioned that our paths had diverged quite a bit recently, but that I had always kept a very close eye on her progress. I watched a single bead of sweat slowly roll down the side of Jasmine's neck. She was suffocating under the immense pressure of her own lies. She knew that if I told Connor the exact nature of our relationship, the entire illusion she had built would instantly shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Connor nodded, accepting my vague explanation without any immediate suspicion. He told me he was glad his bride had such impressive acquaintances in her network. He reached over and gently placed his hand over Jasmine's shaking fingers, completely misinterpreting her sheer terror as simple pre-wedding anxiety. He told her she was trembling and asked if she needed to step outside for some fresh air before dessert was served. Jasmine nodded frantically, unable to form coherent words. She practically jumped out of her chair, knocking her heavy linen napkin onto the carpeted floor. She excused herself with a breathless whisper, claiming she just needed a moment to touch up her makeup. I watched her practically run away from the head table, her high heels stumbling slightly as she rushed toward the exit. Valerie immediately abandoned her seat at the adjacent table and hurried after her golden child, looking like a panicked accomplice fleeing a crime scene. I turned my attention back to my meal, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction settling into my bones. The psychological warfare was working flawlessly. I sat at the head table watching the empty chairs where my mother and sister had been sitting just moments before. Connor looked slightly confused by his bride abruptly fleeing the dining area, but he was too polite to make a scene in front of his esteemed guests. Harrison leaned over and offered me another glass of vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the intense family drama that was silently unfolding right under his nose. I accepted the drink with a gracious nod and engaged in a few more minutes of high-level financial discussion regarding the upcoming cybersecurity audit. Once the conversation reached a natural pause, I politely excused myself from the table, claiming I wanted to stretch my legs and admire the stunning architecture of the ballroom. I stood up, smoothing the crimson fabric of my tailored suit, and began walking slowly through the sea of wealthy elites. My eyes continuously scanned the massive room, looking for any sign of my treacherous family members. It took exactly 12 minutes for Valerie to reappear through the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. She was entirely alone this time. Jasmine was likely still hiding in the restroom, having a complete mental breakdown over my unexpected presence. Valerie looked incredibly frantic, her eyes darting nervously across the room until they landed on me, standing near a towering crystal ice sculpture. She quickly looked away, her expression hardening into something deeply malicious and highly calculated. I knew my mother better than anyone else in the world. I knew that since her attempt to physically intimidate me had failed spectacularly, she would immediately pivot to her favorite and most destructive weapon. She was going to use social sabotage. I watched carefully as Valerie adjusted the collar of her counterfeit designer dress and took a deep, steadying breath to prepare for her upcoming theatrical performance. She marched directly toward the imported marble bar area located on the far left side of the grand ballroom. Standing near the bar was the mother of Connor, a remarkably elegant woman who radiated old money sophistication and quiet authority. She was the matriarch of the billionaire venture capital family, and her opinion dictated the social standing of everyone in her elite circle. Valerie knew exactly who held the social power in this room, and she was determined to poison the well before I could expose their massive financial lies. I casually picked up a small plate of appetizers from a passing waiter and slowly made my way toward the bar area. I moved with deliberate stealth, blending in with the surrounding guests, who were eager to smile and nod at the tech genius Harrison had just publicly endorsed. I positioned myself strategically behind a massive floor-to-ceiling floral arrangement of imported white roses and hanging orchids. The dense flowers completely shielded me from the line of sight of Valerie, but placed me less than 5 feet away from where she was standing with the mother of Connor. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, and listened as my own mother began to weave the most horrific and destructive lie I had ever heard. Valerie reached out and gently touched the arm of the wealthy matriarch, her voice trembling with manufactured grief and fake maternal sorrow. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her purse and dabbed at the corners of her eyes, pretending to wipe away tears. She stated that she needed to share a very painful family secret regarding the woman sitting at the head table. Valerie lowered her voice into a dramatic, hushed whisper, claiming that her heart was breaking, having to confess such a terrible tragedy. She pointed a shaking finger in the general direction of where I had been standing earlier. She explicitly stated that Aaliyah was her estranged eldest daughter, who had been a severe violent drug addict for over a decade. I listened in cold silence as the atrocious lies poured effortlessly from her mouth. Valerie claimed that I had completely drained their family bank accounts to feed my dangerous habits. She looked the mother of Connor directly in the eyes and swore that I had stolen the entire college fund of Jasmine, leaving her precious golden child to struggle and suffer through school. She painted Jasmine as an absolute saint, a resilient victim who had overcome immense trauma and financial ruin caused entirely by my selfish addictions. Valerie let out a fake sob, covering her mouth with her hand. She claimed that I was currently living in a halfway house for troubled women and that they had only allowed me to attend this rehearsal dinner out of pure Christian charity because Jasmine had such a forgiving and beautiful heart. The performance was worthy of an Academy Award in its sheer manipulation and emotional depravity. She twisted the reality of my departure 14 years ago, turning my financial starvation and forced independence into a story of criminal addiction and theft. She was actively assassinating my character to ensure that if I ever tried to tell Connor the truth about the massive debt hole of Jasmine, they would immediately dismiss me as a deranged lying addict looking for a payout. The mother of Connor reacted exactly as Valerie had calculated. The elegant matriarch gasped softly, placing a hand over her diamond necklace in profound shock. Her expression rapidly shifted from polite hospitality to deep, profound disgust. She looked toward the center of the room, her eyes searching for me with obvious revulsion and pity. She patted Valerie on the shoulder, offering her sincere sympathies for having to endure such a horrific family burden. She praised Jasmine for being so incredibly brave and forgiving to allow her abuser to attend such an elite gathering. The wealthy matriarch immediately turned and signaled to several other high society women standing nearby. The whisper network activated instantly. Like a toxic virus spreading through the ballroom, the vicious lie was rapidly transmitted from guest to guest. I watched from behind the floral arrangement as the atmosphere in the room began to shift drastically. Wealthy guests who had been eager to shake my hand just moments ago were now looking at me from afar, with judgment, fear, and absolute disdain. People began to subtly step away from the area where I was standing. The calculated social isolation was being deployed flawlessly by my mother. She stood near the bar watching the elite crowd turn against me, a smug, victorious smirk finally breaking through her fake tears. She truly believed she had won the psychological war. She thought she had successfully silenced me by destroying my credibility in front of the only people who mattered tonight. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I did not feel the urge to run out from behind the flowers and scream the truth at the top of my lungs. Defending myself loudly would only make me look exactly like the unhinged addict she claimed I was. Instead, I remained completely unbothered and entirely focused. My tech chief executive officer instincts took over, replacing any lingering emotional hurt with pure strategic calculation. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored crimson jacket and pulled out my designer clutch purse. I snapped open the gold clasp. Inside the purse, sitting right next to my lip gloss, was a highly advanced, customized micro-recording device. It was a piece of military-grade surveillance technology built specifically by my cybersecurity team for high-level corporate audits. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the side of the device, activating the hidden microphone. The tiny red indicator light blinked twice, confirming that it was actively recording and syncing the encrypted audio file directly to my secure offshore servers. I casually dropped the active device back into my clutch, leaving the clasp slightly open to ensure crystal clear sound quality. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile, realizing that Valerie had just handed me the exact, undeniable evidence I needed to destroy her. She thought she was building a shield of lies, but she had actually just handed me the ammunition for a massive, devastating defamation lawsuit. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, ready to let her keep talking. I stepped out from behind the towering floral arrangement, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the main ballroom behind me. I did not bother looking back at Valerie, who was still busy securing her toxic web of lies with the wealthy elite. My objective right now was not the mother, but the golden child. I walked with deliberate, unhurried steps across the thick carpet, heading straight toward the lavish marble restrooms located down a quiet, secluded corridor. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was playing the role of the perfect bait. I caught my reflection in the gold-trimmed mirrors lining the hallway. My crimson suit looked flawless without a single wrinkle. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass door of the women's restroom and stepped into the brightly lit, opulent space. It was completely empty, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla soap and fresh lilies. I walked over to the gilded sink, turning on the warm water and slowly washing my hands. I did not have to wait long. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy glass door flew open with a violent, aggressive force that echoed sharply against the marble-tiled walls. Jasmine stormed into the restroom. Her chest was heaving, and her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into tight, shaking fists. She turned around immediately and pushed the heavy brass lock on the door, securing us inside the sound-isolating room. We were entirely alone. The sweet, demure, and innocent bride persona that she had been performing flawlessly all evening instantly vanished. The delicate, shy smile she used to captivate Connor and his billionaire family was completely gone, replaced by a twisted, ugly sneer of pure desperation and rage. Jasmine marched across the immaculate marble floor, closing the distance between us until she was standing just inches away from my shoulder. She pointed her shaking finger directly at my face, her voice dropping into a vicious, menacing tone that vibrated with intense hostility. "You are going to leave Chicago right now," she demanded, her eyes wide and unhinged. "I do not care how much money you have or what kind of tech company you run. You are going to pack your bags, walk out of this hotel, and fly your private jet back to wherever you came from before you ruin my entire life." I reached out, pulling a thick linen towel from the gold dispenser. I slowly dried my hands, completely ignoring her frantic, aggressive demands. My absolute silence only infuriated her further. She stepped closer, attempting to physically intimidate me by invading my personal space. "If you do not walk out of this resort, right this second, I am going to rip the sleeve of my own wedding dress," she threatened, her voice shaking with desperate malice. "I will scratch my own face and call the police. I will tell them that my estranged, unstable sister cornered me in the restroom and physically assaulted me out of pure jealousy. Connor and his family will believe every single word I say, because Mom already planted the seed that you are a violent, unpredictable addict. They will have you arrested and dragged out of this hotel in handcuffs. Your elite corporate reputation will be absolutely destroyed by the time the morning news airs. You will lose everything you built." I casually tossed the damp linen towel into the brass wastebasket. I turned to fully face my younger sister, observing the frantic, desperate sweat ruining her expensive bridal makeup. I did not feel a single ounce of fear at her unhinged threats of framing me for assault. I just felt a deep, profound sense of pity for how incredibly pathetic she had become. "You really think threatening me with a fake police report is going to work, Jasmine?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and dangerously low. "I am not the naive 22-year-old girl you and Valerie used to bully. I am a highly protected executive with a legal team that could bury you before you even dialed emergency services." Furthermore, I continued, stepping slightly closer to her, making her instinctively back away. "You do not actually want the police investigating anything about your life right now, do you? Especially not when you are actively drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of commercial debt." I watched the blood completely drain from her face for the second time that evening. Her eyes darted around the empty restroom, as if looking for an escape route from the harsh, undeniable truth. I leaned in, ensuring my voice was sharp and clear. "I saw the massive financial hole in your corporate registry, Jasmine. I know about the collection agencies circling your accounts. I know that Valerie had 3 different credit cards declined at the front desk this afternoon because your family is completely and utterly broke. You are wearing a cheap counterfeit dress, pretending to be a wealthy bride while actively suffocating under a mountain of unpaid bills. You are nothing but a desperate fraud trying to secure a rich husband before your entire financial reality violently collapses." The sheer, brutal honesty of my words pushed her completely over the edge of sanity. Jasmine lost whatever tiny shred of emotional control she had left. Her face turned an ugly, blotchy shade of red, and the veins in her neck strained against her skin. She completely abandoned her fabricated high society composure and unleashed a torrent of defensive, screaming rage. "I do not need your dirty money," she shrieked, her voice echoing deafeningly off the marble walls and crystal mirrors. "I do not care about the collection agencies or the declined credit cards. Tomorrow afternoon, I am marrying Connor, and the exact second I sign that marriage certificate, I will have unrestricted access to millions of dollars. I am transferring $200,000 from his family charity account to pay off all of my mother's secret debts the second the ink dries. They have absolutely no idea how their trust funds are structured, and they will never even notice the money is missing until it is far too late to do anything about it. I have secured my future, and you cannot stop me from taking exactly what I deserve." She stood there, panting heavily, her chest heaving as the horrific, incredibly incriminating confession hung heavily in the quiet air of the luxury restroom. She truly believed she had just won the argument by proving she had a master plan to secure her fraudulent, wealthy lifestyle. She thought she was bragging about her ultimate successful manipulation of a good, honest man. She was entirely oblivious to the absolute catastrophic mistake she had just made. I did not argue with her twisted logic. I did not express shock or moral outrage at her blatant admitted intention to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charitable foundation of her future husband. I simply looked at her with a calm, serene expression of total victory. I slowly reached down and picked up my designer clutch purse from the marble counter. I let my fingers brush gently against the gold clasp, leaving it slightly ajar. I looked down, ensuring the tiny red indicator light of my custom military-grade recording device was still blinking steadily, confirming that every single word of her unhinged illegal confession had been perfectly captured and uploaded to my secure servers. I looked back up at my sister, letting a warm, genuine smile spread across my face for the very first time that entire evening. "Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials, sis," I said, my voice smooth and dripping with dark, impending promise. "I am absolutely certain tomorrow is going to be a day that none of us will ever forget." The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my presidential penthouse, casting long, golden shadows across the imported hardwood floors. It was the morning of the wedding. The entire resort was buzzing with frantic energy as hundreds of staff members prepared for the elite high society event taking place downstairs. I was sitting at the massive glass dining table drinking my espresso and reviewing the encrypted financial data my team was actively compiling. I was completely at peace. The psychological warfare I had waged the previous night was already yielding magnificent results. My private security team stationed in the lobby had reported that Valerie and Jasmine were both in a state of absolute hysteria, ordering staff around and screaming at each other behind closed doors. The heavy oak door of my suite echoed with a soft, hesitant knock. It was not the crisp, confident knock of hotel service or the assertive rap of security. It was a weak, nervous sound. I stood up, smoothing the tailored fabric of my silk morning robe, and walked slowly across the expansive living area. I pressed the security monitor on the wall and saw my father David standing in the carpeted hallway. I was shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking down at his polished dress shoes while repeatedly adjusting the collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt. I had not spoken a single direct word to this man in 14 years. He had avoided my gaze at the rehearsal dinner, deliberately sitting at the far end of the room to escape the reality of my presence. Now he was standing at my door, seeking an audience. I pulled the brass handle and opened the door wide, allowing the bright sunlight from my penthouse to spill into the dim hallway. David physically flinched when we made eye contact. He looked older and much more fragile than I remembered. The years of living under the toxic, oppressive thumb of Valerie had completely drained the life out of him. He stared past me, taking in the sheer, breathtaking opulence of the multi-million-dollar suite. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously as he processed the undeniable magnitude of my wealth and status. I did not offer a hug or a warm parental greeting. He simply stood there looking like a cornered animal, asking if he could step inside for a brief moment. I stepped back, allowing him to enter my space. He walked to the center of the living room, keeping his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He looked completely out of place, surrounded by modern art and luxury furnishings that cost more than his entire house. David cleared his throat, adopting the soft, placating tone he always used when trying to smooth over the horrific actions of his wife and youngest daughter. He told me he was here to play the role of the concerned peacemaker. He claimed that the entire family was in a state of severe distress because of my sudden, unexpected appearance in Chicago. He looked at the floor while speaking, unable to maintain direct eye contact with me. He said that Valerie was currently lying in her standard hotel room, experiencing severe chest pains from the overwhelming stress. He claimed that Jasmine was crying uncontrollably in her makeup chair, terrified that her special day was going to be completely ruined by family drama. I stood perfectly still, watching him weave a narrative of false victimhood for the two women who had spent their entire lives making me miserable. David finally looked up, his eyes pleading with me to be the submissive, obedient daughter I used to be. He asked me to be the bigger person and simply walk away. He begged me to pack my bags and leave the resort before the ceremony began so that Jasmine could have a peaceful wedding. He actually had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to tell me that I had made my point and that I should not ruin this monumental day for the rest of the family. He told me that family should protect each other and that walking away would be the most mature Christian thing I could possibly do. I let his pathetic, manipulative words hang heavily in the quiet air of my penthouse. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I looked at the weak, cowardly man standing before me and felt nothing but profound, absolute disgust. I stepped closer to him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I told him that he had absolutely no right to speak to me about family protection or maturity. I reminded him of the humid afternoon 14 years ago when Valerie physically shoved me out of my own college graduation portrait. I painted a vivid picture of the moment she called me ugly and worthless in front of our entire extended family, while they all laughed at my humiliation. I reminded him that I had looked directly at him begging for a father to defend his eldest daughter from a vicious, narcissistic bully. My voice remained cold and razor-sharp as I recounted how he had simply turned his head and stared at the floorboards, refusing to speak a single word in my defense. I told him about the $537 I took from my mattress. I told him about walking 3 miles in the dark to the bus station with my entire life packed into one faded duffel bag. I made sure he understood that his silence on that day was a deliberate, active choice. He chose his own comfort over my safety and my dignity. David began to stammer, attempting to make weak excuses about how difficult Valerie could be and how he was just trying to keep the peace in the household back then. I cut him off immediately. I told him that keeping the peace was just a cowardly excuse for enabling abuse. He had watched them tear me down piece by piece for 2 decades and never lifted a single finger to stop them. He was not a peacemaker, he was an accomplice. I stepped even closer, pointing toward the heavy oak door. I told him that his cowardice was a choice then, and his pathetic attempt to guilt-trip me right now was a choice today. I informed him that I was not going anywhere, and that I would attend the wedding of my sister, because I was an invited guest of the billionaire family hosting the event. I told him that I did not care if Valerie had chest pains or if Jasmine cried off her expensive bridal makeup. They were finally facing the consequences of their own monstrous actions, and he was entirely powerless to protect them from the storm that was about to hit. I commanded him to get out of my room and never attempt to speak to me like a father again, because he lost that privilege the night he let me walk out into the dark with nothing. David looked absolutely shattered. His shoulders slumped completely, and his eyes filled with tears of deep, profound shame. He realized that none of his usual manipulation tactics would work on the powerful woman standing before him. He turned around without saying another word and shuffled slowly out of my penthouse, looking like a hollow, defeated ghost. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing him out of my life. I took a deep, calming breath and walked back over to my glass dining table. I picked up my espresso cup, feeling a surge of dominant energy coursing through my veins. The final emotional tie to that toxic family had just been permanently severed. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and turned my attention back to my encrypted laptop screen. The moment I touched the trackpad, a massive flashing red alert completely overtook my main display monitor. A high-priority emergency notification from my cybersecurity software blared from the speakers. My firm was actively monitoring the internal network of the investment fund belonging to the family of Connor. The alert indicated that a severe critical breach was currently in progress. I leaned forward instantly, dropping my coffee cup onto the saucer. My eyes scanned the rapidly scrolling data logs appearing on the screen. The financial audit software had just detected a massive, unauthorized movement of capital. Someone was actively attempting to bypass the secondary security protocols on a highly restricted charitable trust account. I watched the numbers flash brightly against the dark background of my terminal. A massive, unexplainable red flag had just triggered an automatic lockdown sequence. The digital trap I had laid was springing shut, and the timing was absolutely explosive. I watched the bright crimson warning lights pulse rhythmically across my primary display monitor. The advanced security algorithm I had personally designed for the massive investment fund of the family of Connor was currently intercepting a highly sophisticated financial maneuver. I pulled my hands away from the keyboard for a brief second, observing the rapidly scrolling data logs with a cold, clinical fascination. I dragged the encrypted data packet into an isolated sandbox environment on my computer. This allowed me to carefully dissect the unauthorized activity without triggering an external system shutdown that would alert the thief. Someone operating within the secure wireless network of the luxury resort was actively attempting to push a massive wire transfer through a series of automated clearinghouses. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of attempting blatant digital theft, while my entire elite cybersecurity firm was actively auditing the network, was absolutely staggering. I ran a deep trace protocol, initiating a direct search for the specific origin point of the illicit transaction request. The physical internet protocol address pinged back instantly. The digital signal was originating directly from the lavish bridal preparation suite, located exactly 3 floors below my presidential penthouse. Jasmine was not waiting until after the wedding ceremony to steal the money. Her overwhelming panic and sheer financial desperation had completely overridden her severely limited common sense. She had somehow managed to secretly acquire the secure administrative login credentials belonging to her wealthy future husband. I pulled up the master access logs and quickly confirmed my dark suspicion. The highly secure laptop, officially assigned to Connor, had just been used to bypass the secondary corporate firewall of his family charitable trust account. Jasmine was actively initiating a direct priority wire transfer for exactly $200,000. The immense sum of money was being rapidly funneled away from a philanthropic foundation intended to support underprivileged youth programs across the city. She was routing the stolen funds toward an obscure offshore holding company designed to launder the transaction. She was sitting in her white bridal gown, surrounded by hairstylists and makeup artists, casually committing federal wire fraud on her wedding day. I initiated a comprehensive background sweep on the receiving corporate entity. The suspicious shell company was registered under a deeply obfuscated corporate umbrella located in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic financial structure specifically designed to hide the true identity of the primary beneficiary from standard government tax audits. But my proprietary software was explicitly built to ruthlessly dismantle corporate illusions and expose hidden assets. Within 4 minutes, my aggressive algorithm stripped away the fake registration layers and exposed the original incorporation documents holding the true signature of the owner. The primary managing director of the offshore account was officially listed as Valerie. The $200,000 was being directly routed to pay off the massive, aggressive commercial loan sharks my mother had foolishly entangled herself with. Jasmine was actively embezzling a fortune from the billionaire family, mere hours before walking down the aisle, solely to save our toxic mother from complete financial ruin and severe legal consequences. They truly believed they were criminal masterminds capable of outsmarting a billionaire investment firm. They thought their petty suburban manipulation tactics would work seamlessly in the ruthless world of high finance. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that I was watching their every single digital move in real time. I did not block the illegal transaction immediately. I allowed the digital transfer request to reach the final internal processing stage. I methodically captured every single keystroke, every secure authorization protocol, and every digital signature Jasmine fraudulently used to approve the massive theft. Once I had successfully secured the absolute undeniable proof of her federal wire fraud, I manually intervened. I executed a hard override command and quietly froze the stolen funds in a temporary holding account, preventing the money from actually leaving the internal network and reaching the offshore account of Valerie. The money was trapped securely in a digital vault only I could open. I opened a blank master document on my screen and began compiling a pristine, highly detailed digital dossier. I approached the task with the cold, calculating precision of a surgeon operating on a terminal patient. I included the exact timestamps of the unauthorized login credentials. I documented the specific routing numbers and the unmasked corporate registry, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Valerie was the intended recipient of the stolen charitable funds. I inserted the captured network tracking data, proving the theft originated directly from the bridal suite. To ensure the destruction was absolutely total and irreversible, I also attached the transcribed audio file from the restroom confrontation the previous night. The transcript explicitly documented Jasmine admitting her entire criminal master plan to steal the money the second the ink dried on her marriage certificate. The dossier was a flawless, impenetrable weapon of absolute truth. I sent the completed comprehensive document to the heavy-duty wireless laser printer sitting on the polished credenza of my penthouse office. The machine hummed quietly, producing 20 pages of absolute, undeniable destruction. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the printer. I gathered the warm, crisp papers and tapped the edges gently against the glass dining table, aligning them perfectly. I read over the top page, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction settling into my bones. The narrative they had carefully constructed over the past 14 years was about to violently collapse under the crushing weight of their own documented greed. I walked over to my leather overnight bag and pulled out a sleek, thick black envelope made of premium, expensive cardstock. I slid the extensive damning evidence inside the dark envelope, ensuring the pages were perfectly smooth. I sealed the flap, firmly pressing my thumb along the edge to secure the devastating package. I walked over to the suite telephone and dialed the direct priority line to the main concierge desk. The luxury hotel manager answered the phone immediately, his voice ringing with eager professional respect. I instructed him to procure a bottle of their most expensive and exclusive vintage scotch from the private reserve cellar. I told him to place the heavy crystal bottle on a polished silver tray, alongside the black envelope I was currently placing outside my penthouse door. I commanded him to deliver the silver tray directly to the groom in his private preparation suite on the lower level. I was extremely specific with my final instruction. I told the manager he must hand the black envelope to Connor personally and ensure no one else in the room intercepted the delivery. The manager agreed instantly, promising to execute my strict orders without a single delay. I hung up the phone and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the magnificent city skyline. I had just deployed the ultimate weapon, and now all I had to do was wait for the beautiful, catastrophic explosion. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my presidential penthouse, looking out over the magnificent Chicago skyline. The early afternoon sunlight reflected off the steel and glass skyscrapers, mirroring the cold, calculated clarity in my own mind. I had just handed the luxury hotel manager the black envelope containing the absolute destruction of my sister. I knew that at this exact second, a waiter in a crisp white tuxedo was carrying a silver tray down to the groom's preparation suite. The digital trap had been perfectly sprung, and the explosive shockwave was already silently rippling through the ultra-luxurious corridors of the resort. I did not have to wait very long for the catastrophic fallout to reach my top-floor sanctuary. Less than 20 minutes after I dispatched the devastating dossier, the heavy oak door of my penthouse suite burst open with a violent, frantic force. The sudden loud crash echoed sharply against the imported hardwood floors and the vaulted ceilings of the expansive living area. I did not flinch or turn around immediately. I simply took a slow, measured breath, savoring the undeniable scent of approaching desperation. I slowly rotated, witnessed the absolute magnificent collapse of the golden child. Jasmine stumbled into the center of my expansive living room, looking like a completely deranged, chaotic nightmare. The pristine, elegant bride persona she had meticulously cultivated was entirely shattered. She was wearing the bottom half of an incredibly expensive custom-designed wedding gown, but the bodice was unbuttoned and hanging loosely around her waist. She was wearing a silk preparation robe, hastily thrown over her shoulders, attempting to cover her shivering frame. Her bridal makeup was only half finished. One of her eyes was perfectly blended with expensive luxury eyeshadow, while the other was completely bare, making her look asymmetrical and deeply unhinged. She was clutching her smartphone so tightly in her shaking hands that her knuckles were entirely white. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if she had just sprinted up all the flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. She did not even seem to register that she had barged into my private space. She was completely consumed by a blinding, all-encompassing panic. She started screaming hysterically, pacing back and forth across my expensive woven rugs. She wailed that her entire life was violently falling apart right before her eyes. She looked at her phone screen and shrieked that she had just received a catastrophic automated alert from the offshore banking portal. The massive wire transfer she had illegally initiated from the charitable trust of her wealthy future husband had been completely blocked. She screamed that an external corporate auditor had intercepted the transaction and permanently frozen the $200,000 in a highly restricted holding account. She was frantically tapping her phone screen, trying desperately to bypass the digital freeze, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. She sobbed that if she did not get the money pushed through immediately, the aggressive commercial loan sharks would completely liquidate the salon of Valerie and instantly go to the local press to expose their massive, fraudulent debt to the entire elite society of Chicago. I watched her chaotic, humiliating meltdown with complete emotional detachment. I did not offer her a glass of water or a comforting word. I simply walked over to the massive glass dining table where my encrypted laptop was currently resting. I tapped the trackpad gently, waking up the high-resolution display monitor. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the room, casting a sharp blue glow across my face. Jasmine stopped her frantic pacing the exact moment she saw the bright screen. She slowly walked toward the glass table, her breathing ragged and uneven. She looked down at my open laptop. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the complex data logs, the frozen routing numbers, and the undeniable timestamp of the exact unauthorized transaction she had initiated less than an hour ago. She saw the master override command sitting securely in my personal administrative dashboard. Above all the technical data, she saw the gleaming corporate logo of Apex Digital prominently displayed as the lead auditing firm for the massive investment fund. The horrifying, catastrophic realization hit her like a runaway freight train. The oxygen completely left her lungs. She looked from the glowing laptop screen up to my cold, unbothered face. Her jaw dropped open as she finally understood the monumental, inescapable magnitude of her mistake. The external corporate auditor, who had ruthlessly trapped her stolen funds, was not some faceless, anonymous banker sitting in a downtown cubicle. It was me. I was the architect of her absolute destruction. The very sister she had publicly degraded, called ugly, and attempted to have thrown out of the luxury resort was currently holding the master key to her entire fraudulent existence. The last tiny shred of fabricated pride Jasmine possessed completely evaporated into thin air. Her knees literally buckled beneath her. She collapsed directly onto the polished hardwood floor, landing with a heavy, sickening thud. The massive layers of her expensive custom white wedding gown pooled around her in a messy, chaotic heap, completely ruining the delicate imported silk fabric against the floorboards. She did not care about the dress anymore. She did not care about looking elegant or poised or superior. She fell forward, crawling on her hands and knees until she was positioned directly at my feet. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my tailored crimson trousers, her fingers shaking violently. "Please," she begged, her voice deteriorating into a pathetic, miserable wail. "Please, Aaliyah, you have to unfreeze the funds right now. You have to let the transfer go through to the offshore account. I am begging you on my hands and knees. If Connor finds out that I tried to take money from his family charity, he will instantly cancel the wedding. He will call the federal authorities and have me arrested for wire fraud. His billionaire parents will absolutely destroy my entire life, and they will throw our mother into prison for extortion and embezzlement. I will lose everything I have ever worked for. I will do absolutely anything you want me to do. I will get down and kiss your shoes. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire wedding congregation. Just please hit the button and release the money. I cannot go to jail, Aaliyah. I am supposed to be a wealthy elite bride today. You cannot take this away from me. I deserve to be happy and rich after everything I have done. Please just let me have this one thing and I will never bother you again." The agonizing sound of her breathless crying filled the massive penthouse suite, but it did not move me in the slightest. This was the exact same woman who had laughed mockingly when our mother shoved me out of my own graduation photo. This was the exact same woman who had enthusiastically participated in spreading a vicious, malicious rumor to her wealthy future in-laws, claiming that I was a violent, unpredictable drug addict who stole her college fund. She had tried to actively assassinate my character less than 12 hours ago to protect her own fraudulent social standing. She had attempted to have me physically thrown out of the luxury resort by hotel security simply because my presence threatened to expose the truth of her deeply impoverished reality. Now the tables were completely turned, and she was suddenly begging for sisterly solidarity and forgiveness. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of her desperate pleas only hardened my resolve. I had not come to this luxury resort to offer salvation or grace. I had come to deliver pure, unadulterated justice. I calmly stepped backward, forcing her desperate grabbing hands to slip off the expensive fabric of my suit. I looked down at my own hands, examining my perfectly manicured nails with casual, unbothered interest. I let a cold, ruthless smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You should get back to your makeup chair, Jasmine," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and dripping with absolute finality. "Beauty is the only thing you have left." The grand ballroom of the luxury resort had been completely transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of old money elegance and extreme excess. Thousands of imported white roses and rare orchids cascaded from massive floral arches, reaching all the way up to the vaulted ceilings. The heavy scent of the expensive blooms filled the large space, masking the absolute stench of desperation that my mother and sister carried with them. Three massive crystal chandeliers cast a soft, romantic glow over the hundreds of wealthy elite guests who were taking their assigned seats in the velvet-lined chairs. A live string quartet sat perfectly positioned on a raised platform near the front, playing a hauntingly beautiful classical melody that echoed softly off the gilded walls. It was the absolute picture of high society perfection. It was a carefully constructed multi-million-dollar illusion funded entirely by the family of Connor and orchestrated by the obsessive, frantic vanity of Valerie. I stood alone at the very back of the expansive room, leaning casually against the heavy oak doors that served as the main entrance. I had chosen my vantage point with extreme strategic precision. From this elevated position in the back, I had a completely unobstructed view of the entire wedding congregation, including the elaborate altar where the massive execution was about to take place. I crossed my arms over my tailored crimson suit, feeling the solid weight of my encrypted smartphone resting in my inner pocket. I was perfectly still, blending into the shadows, while radiating a cold, patient energy. I did not need to mingle with the oblivious guests, or find a seat among the sea of pastel dresses and dark, expensive tuxedos. I was simply the architect waiting quietly in the dark for the fuse to finally hit the highly explosive powder keg I had constructed. My eyes tracked the front row where the immediate families were seated. Valerie was positioned in the absolute best seat in the house, located directly next to the center aisle. She was wearing a completely new outfit, having likely rushed to a boutique in a blind panic after her credit cards were repeatedly declined at the reception desk. She sat perfectly straight, forcing a wide, beaming smile onto her face that looked painfully artificial and incredibly tight. She was trying so desperately to project the image of a proud, wealthy matriarch, marrying off her beautiful aristocratic daughter. She nodded politely to the billionaire parents of Connor sitting just across the aisle, pretending that she belonged in their exclusive tax bracket. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the black envelope containing her complete financial and criminal ruin was currently resting inside the jacket pocket of the groom standing just a few feet away from her. Sitting directly next to Valerie was my father, David. He looked like a hollow shell of a man wearing a rented tuxedo that did not fit him quite right. He kept his head slightly bowed, refusing to make eye contact with anyone around him. He was a coward who had chosen to enable the toxic narcissistic abuse of his wife rather than protect his eldest daughter. And now he was sitting quietly while his youngest daughter walked into a marriage built entirely on severe federal wire fraud. He occasionally rubbed his temples, looking physically ill, as if the immense weight of their collective lies was finally crushing his spine. I watched them both with absolute profound detachment. They were no longer my parents. They were simply two pathetic strangers about to reap the devastating consequences of a lifetime of manipulation and cruelty. The soft classical music flowing from the string quartet suddenly shifted, transitioning into the traditional triumphant wedding march. The hundreds of wealthy guests collectively rose to their feet, turning their heads toward the heavy oak doors where I was standing. I stepped slightly to the side, allowing the venue staff to pull the massive doors completely open. The bright afternoon sunlight from the hallway spilled into the dimly lit ballroom, illuminating the entrance. Jasmine stepped into the grand archway looking like an absolute flawless angelic vision. She was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed white silk gown featuring intricate lace, detailing, and a cathedral-length train that swept majestically across the marble floor. Her hair and makeup had been completely redone, erasing all the chaotic, frantic sweat and smeared eyeliner from her humiliating breakdown in the penthouse restroom. She had somehow managed to completely compartmentalize the sheer terror of our previous confrontation, tucking it away behind a mask of pure, innocent bridal joy. She gripped a massive bouquet of white peonies in her hands, taking her first slow, deliberate step down the long, white carpeted aisle. She truly believed she had gotten away with it. She thought that because I had left her sobbing on the floor and walked out of the suite, I was simply going to sit back and allow her to marry into the billionaire family without interference. She thought my silence was a sign of mercy, or perhaps an indication that I did not actually possess the devastating digital proof of her embezzlement. As she glided down the aisle, she turned her head slightly and locked eyes with me, standing in the shadows by the door. For a fraction of a second, her perfect angelic smile faltered. A rapid flash of raw, unadulterated fear passed behind her eyes, betraying the deep panic she was desperately trying to conceal. I did not break eye contact. I simply offered her a slow, chilling smile that promised absolute destruction. She quickly snapped her head back toward the front of the room, forcing her fake, joyful expression to return as she focused entirely on her wealthy future husband waiting at the altar. She continued her slow, majestic march, passing row after row of Chicago elite socialites who looked at her with polite admiration. She passed Valerie, who let out a loud, theatrical sob of fake maternal joy, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She passed David, who managed a weak, trembling smile. She was gliding through a sea of absolute deception, believing that every single step brought her closer to the unrestricted millions she planned to steal the exact second the ceremony concluded. She was marching toward what she thought was her ultimate social and financial salvation, completely unaware that she was actually walking directly onto a meticulously prepared scaffold. I shifted my gaze away from my sister and focused entirely on Connor, who was standing perfectly still at the elaborate floral altar. The contrast between the bride and the groom was incredibly stark and deeply fascinating to observe. While Jasmine was projecting overwhelming manufactured joy, Connor was radiating a cold, dense, impenetrable silence. He did not have the look of a man who was eagerly waiting to marry the absolute love of his life. He stood with his feet planted firmly apart, his posture rigid and highly analytical. His jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. He was staring directly at Jasmine as she approached, but his handsome face was entirely unreadable. There was no warm, welcoming smile, no tears of happiness, and no nervous, excited energy. He looked exactly like a ruthless corporate executive who had just discovered a massive, fatal flaw in a multi-million-dollar merger agreement and was preparing to aggressively terminate the entire contract. He watched Jasmine take final steps up to the elevated platform, her heavy silk train settling softly around her feet. The priest stepped forward, opening his ornate book, ready to begin the sacred, solemn ceremony. Jasmine reached out with her trembling, manicured hands, expecting Connor to take them in a gentle, loving grasp as they prepared to recite their vows. Connor did not reach out to take her hands. He stood perfectly still, looking down at her with an expression of pure, absolute clinical detachment. The silence at the altar stretched for a few heavy, uncomfortable seconds. Jasmine let her empty hands fall awkwardly to her sides, her fake smile trembling as confusion began to fracture her perfect facade. She whispered something to him, her voice too low for the guests to hear, but her panic was visibly returning. Connor did not answer her whispered question. He did not offer a reassuring smile or a gentle touch to calm her sudden anxiety. Instead, he slowly and deliberately reached his right hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored navy tuxedo jacket. The precise, calculated movement was slow enough to draw the absolute, undivided attention of everyone watching, but purposeful enough to indicate that the ceremony was about to be violently derailed. I leaned back against the heavy oak door, crossing my arms over my chest, and watched with profound satisfaction as the fuse finally hit the powder keg. The elderly priest stood at the head of the magnificent floral altar, his deep, resonant voice echoing across the silent, grand ballroom. He held a leather-bound ceremonial book in his hands, looking warmly between the bride and the groom. He began speaking passionately about the absolute sanctity of marriage and the deep, profound importance of unwavering honesty between two partners. He told the hundreds of wealthy elite guests that a successful union was built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual trust and financial transparency. The suffocating irony of his beautiful religious words hung heavily in the air. He was standing there lecturing about honesty to a woman who had just committed severe federal wire fraud less than 2 hours ago. Jasmine was nodding along to his sermon, pretending to absorb the holy words, while actively hiding a massive criminal embezzlement scheme beneath her custom white silk gown. I remained standing perfectly still at the very back of the room, leaning casually against the heavy oak entrance doors. I did not move a single muscle as I watched the disastrous theatrical performance unfolding on the elevated platform. Connor was standing directly across from Jasmine, holding her trembling hands in his own. He did not look like a man who was eagerly preparing to pledge his eternal love and devotion. He looked like a marble statue carved from pure ice. His posture was completely rigid, and his broad shoulders were locked in a state of intense physical tension. He was staring down at Jasmine, but his eyes were entirely empty and unreadable. He was not blinking or offering her any soft, reassuring smiles. His tailored navy tuxedo looked less like wedding attire and more like corporate battle armor. Sitting in the front row, the billionaire parents of Connor were completely oblivious to the catastrophic storm brewing right in front of them. Harrison was beaming with absolute paternal pride watching his son stand at the altar. He had no idea that the charitable trust fund he managed had just been targeted for a massive illegal withdrawal by the sweet innocent girl standing next to his son. Beside him, Valerie was putting on the performance of a lifetime. My toxic mother was dabbing at her dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, pretending to be overwhelmed by the sheer emotional beauty of the ceremony. She was sitting up perfectly straight, ensuring the society photographers captured her good side while she played the role of the proud, successful matriarch. David sat next to her, looking entirely hollow and defeated, staring blankly at the floral arrangements, as if he wished the floor would simply open up and swallow him whole. Jasmine was visibly disintegrating under the intense pressure of the moment. The heavy, expensive silk of her wedding dress seemed to be physically suffocating her. I could see a distinct layer of nervous sweat pooling at her collarbone, glistening under the bright crystal chandeliers. She was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving with shallow, frantic gasps of air. She could not focus on the priest or the religious vows being spoken to her. Instead, she kept violently twitching her head to look over her shoulder. Her panicked, terrified eyes constantly darted toward the back of the massive ballroom where I was standing in the shadows. She was waiting for the executioner to drop the final blade. She was absolutely convinced that I was going to march straight down the center aisle and scream the horrific truth about her criminal debts to the entire congregation. Every single time she looked back at me, I simply offered her a cold, chilling smile. I did not raise my hand or reach into my designer clutch purse to pull out the hidden recording device. I did not make any sudden movements that would trigger hotel security. I just stood there letting the intense psychological torture cook her alive from the inside out. She was completely trapped in a cage of her own making, and the severe anxiety of anticipating my next move was driving her to the brink of total insanity. She knew that I held the absolute power to destroy her wealthy future with one single sentence, and the suspense was literally making her physically ill right there at the altar. The priest finally turned the page of his leather-bound book, signaling the beginning of the most crucial segment of the wedding ceremony. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, seated in the velvet chairs. He raised his voice, ensuring his words carried to every single corner of the expansive luxury ballroom. He asked the traditional solemn question, declaring that marriage was a sacred bond that must not be entered into lightly or with hidden deception. He asked if anyone present in the room knew any lawful reason why these two individuals should not be joined in holy matrimony. He instructed the crowd to speak now or forever hold their peace. The entire ballroom went completely dead silent. The string quartet had completely stopped playing their instruments, leaving a heavy, suffocating quiet in the massive space. You could literally hear a pin drop on the thick imported carpet. The collective breath of hundreds of elite guests caught in their throats as they waited for the traditional moment to pass without interruption. Jasmine whipped her head around one final time, staring directly into my eyes from across the long, white, carpeted aisle. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her hands were shaking so violently that her large bouquet of white peonies was visibly trembling. She was bracing herself for my voice to echo through the room and tear her entire fraudulent world into a million irreparable pieces. I looked right back at her, maintaining my calm, serene expression of total dominance. I did not step forward. I did not open my mouth to speak. I did not make a single sound to disrupt the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the luxury ballroom. I simply stood my ground and allowed the heavy silence to stretch into infinity. I knew that I did not have to be the one to pull the trigger, because I had already handed the loaded weapon to someone else. The sudden movement at the altar caught everyone completely by surprise. Instead of waiting for the priest to continue the ceremony, Connor took decisive physical action. He slowly and deliberately pulled his hands out of the trembling, desperate grasp of Jasmine. He completely severed the physical connection between them, letting her shaking hands fall awkwardly to her sides. He took a massive, deliberate step backward, creating a wide, undeniable distance between himself and his terrified bride. Jasmine gasped loudly, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room as she looked at him in sheer, profound confusion. She reached out toward him again, her voice a pathetic, weak whisper begging him to take her hand. Connor did not reach back. He maintained his cold, clinical expression of absolute detachment. He slowly reached his right hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored navy tuxedo jacket, preparing to unleash absolute hell. Connor slowly pulled his hand out from the inner pocket of his navy tuxedo jacket. He was holding the sleek, thick black envelope made of premium cardstock that I had sent to his suite earlier that morning. He held it tightly in his right hand, gripping the edge so firmly that the paper bent slightly under his thumb. Jasmine stared at the dark envelope with eyes so wide they looked like they might shatter. She did not know exactly what was inside that specific package, but her breathing hitched violently as she recognized the undeniable shape of impending doom. The elderly priest standing behind the ornate floral podium looked highly confused by the unexpected delay. He cleared his throat softly, preparing to prompt the groom to take the hands of his bride once again. Connor did not look at the priest. He did not look at his wealthy parents sitting in the front row. He kept his cold, clinical gaze locked entirely on the terrified woman standing across from him. He took a deep, steadying breath, allowing his chest to expand against the tailored fabric of his suit. He leaned slightly toward the small, discreet microphone clipped carefully to his lapel, ensuring that the audio system captured his voice perfectly. "I have a reason," Connor stated, his voice ringing out sharp and clear through the surround sound speakers of the massive luxury ballroom. The entire room reacted instantly. A collective loud gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite high society guests, seated in the velvet chairs. The sound of sudden shocked murmurs filled the cavernous space. Down in the very front row, Valerie physically jolted as if she had been struck by lightning. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor beneath the carpet. Her hands flew to her mouth, her fake perfect smile completely vanishing as pure, unadulterated panic washed over her aging features. David remained seated next to her, grabbing the armrests of his chair, looking entirely paralyzed by his own cowardice. Jasmine reached her hands out toward Connor, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whimper. She begged him to put the envelope away and just finish the ceremony. She pleaded with him, claiming that whatever he was holding was a complete misunderstanding and that they could talk about it privately in their honeymoon suite. Connor ignored her frantic, pathetic begging. He slid his index finger under the sealed flap of the black envelope and tore it open with one swift, decisive motion. He pulled out the 20 pages of crisp white printer paper containing the absolute, undeniable digital dossier I had meticulously compiled. He unfolded the documents and looked down at the top page. The ballroom was completely electrified with heavy, suffocating tension. The wealthy venture capitalists and elite socialites stretched their necks, trying desperately to see what the groom was holding. Connor tapped his lapel microphone one more time, guaranteeing that every single person in the massive room would hear the horrific, unvarnished truth. "Jasmine," he began, his voice echoing relentlessly off the crystal chandeliers and gilded walls. "You looked me directly in the eyes and told me a deeply tragic story about your family. You told me that your older sister was a violent, unpredictable drug addict. You swore to me that she completely drained your mother of her life savings and maliciously stole your college fund to feed her dangerous habits." Jasmine began to shake violently, her expensive white silk dress rustling loudly around her legs. She tried to step forward to grab the papers out of his hands, but Connor aggressively took another step back, holding the documents high out of her reach. He pointed his finger directly toward the heavy oak entrance doors at the very back of the room where I was standing in the shadows. He directed the attention of the entire wedding congregation straight toward me. "You told my family she was currently locked away in a high-security rehabilitation center." He continued, his tone dripping with profound disgust. "Yet the woman standing right back there by the doors is not a recovering addict. That is your sister, Aaliyah. She is the highly respected chief executive officer of Apex Digital, and she is the elite corporate auditor my father specifically hired to protect our global financial portfolio." Hundreds of heads snapped around instantly to look at me. The mother of Connor gasped loudly, her hands clutching her diamond necklace as she realized the horrifying magnitude of the lie Valerie had told her by the hotel bar. The whispers in the room escalated into loud, shocked conversations. People were openly pointing at my mother, who was now visibly trembling in the front row, trying desperately to shrink away from the burning, judgmental stares of the Chicago elite. Connor looked back at the printed dossier in his hands, flipping to the second page containing the highly detailed wire transfer logs. "But the lies about your sister are not even the worst part of this disgusting charade," he announced, his voice rising in volume and intense fury. "My company auditor, your sister, just provided me with undeniable digital proof of what you did this morning." Connor looked up, glaring at Jasmine with a lethal, burning hatred. "You used my secure laptop while I was meeting with the groomsmen. You bypassed the secondary corporate firewall on my family charitable trust account. You actively stole $200,000 from a philanthropic foundation meant for underprivileged children." Jasmine let out a shrill, piercing shriek. She covered her ears with her hands, shaking her head back and forth, as if trying to physically block out the sound of her own crimes being broadcast to the world. Connor did not show her a single ounce of mercy. He read the routing numbers and the IP addresses directly from the page. He explicitly named the offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. "You initiated a fraudulent wire transfer to pay off the massive secret commercial debts belonging to your mother, Valerie," he stated ruthlessly. "You were planning to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars the exact second we signed the marriage certificate to save your family from complete financial ruin and bankruptcy." The fallout was absolutely catastrophic. The wealthy elite guests were openly expressing their profound revulsion. Old money absolutely despises scandal and blatant theft. Jasmine fell to her knees on the elevated platform, her massive custom-designed train bunching up around her trembling legs. She began screaming hysterically in absolute denial. She wailed that the documents were completely forged and that her jealous sister had fabricated the entire digital audit just to ruin her perfect special day. She sobbed violently, pointing a shaking finger toward the back of the room, screaming that I was a bitter liar, trying to destroy her true love. She looked desperately toward the front row, begging Valerie to help her defend the crumbling illusion. Valerie could not help her. My mother was standing completely frozen, her face an unhealthy shade of pale gray, looking like she was about to suffer a massive cardiac event right there in the aisle. She knew the offshore account had been explicitly named, and the undeniable connection was entirely public. The final devastating blow did not come from me or from Connor. It came from the billionaire patriarch sitting in the front row. Harrison stood up abruptly from his velvet chair, his face an absolute mask of pure lethal billionaire fury. He completely ignored the hysterical screaming bride on the altar. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his own secure smartphone. He rapidly logged into the master administrative portal of the Family Investment Fund, navigating directly to the specific charitable trust account Connor had just named. The entire ballroom watched with bated breath as the powerful patriarch stared down at his glowing phone screen. He tapped the screen twice, confirming the active internal alerts. He slowly raised his head, looking directly at Jasmine sobbing on the floor. He did not yell or lose his composure. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who routinely destroyed entire corporations before breakfast. He announced to the silent, watchful room that the unauthorized transaction was indeed entirely real. He confirmed that $200,000 had been illicitly targeted and was currently trapped in a frozen state by the external auditing software. The facade was entirely and permanently shattered. The moment Harrison confirmed the frozen wire transfer, the entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and outraged whispers. Valerie could not accept the absolute destruction of her carefully fabricated high society reality. My mother snapped out of her paralyzed state and physically shoved past the wealthy guests seated next to her. She practically sprinted down the white carpeted aisle toward the elevated floral altar. Her counterfeit designer dress swished loudly as she frantically waved her arms in the air, trying to command the immediate attention of the horrified billionaire family. Valerie began screaming at the top of her lungs, claiming that the entire digital dossier was a complete and utter malicious forgery. She pointed her shaking finger directly at me, standing in the back of the room, yelling that I was a jealous, bitter woman who had orchestrated an elaborate cyber attack just to ruin the most important day of her golden child. She desperately tried to convince Harrison that the audit report was a fabricated lie designed by a deranged, estranged sister who wanted to tear their beautiful families apart. Jasmine immediately caught on to the frantic lifeline her mother was throwing her. The bride crawled on her hands and knees across the polished platform of the altar, reaching out to grab the pant leg of Connor. She sobbed violently, echoing the unhinged accusations of Valerie swearing on her own life that she had never touched his secure laptop. She cried massive tears that ruined her expensive bridal makeup, leaving dark black streaks running down her cheeks. She wailed that I had planted the digital evidence to frame her out of pure spite and resentment. She begged Connor to believe her, pleading with him to look into her eyes and see the innocent woman he had fallen in love with. The sheer audacity of their continued deception was absolutely staggering to witness. They were staring directly into the face of irrefutable digital evidence and still choosing to double down on their toxic, manipulative lies, trying to save themselves from impending ruin. I watched their pathetic display of desperate deflection with a cold, calculated amusement. They were backed into a corner and reacting exactly like trapped, desperate rats. They truly believed that if they screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, they could somehow gaslight a room full of highly intelligent venture capitalists into ignoring hard factual data. It was finally time for me to step out of the shadows and deliver the ultimate, undeniable death blow. I pushed myself off the heavy oak entrance doors and took my first deliberate step down the center aisle. I did not rush or run like my frantic mother. I walked with the slow, measured pacing of an apex predator who had already caught its prey. The sea of wealthy elite guests immediately parted for me, pulling their velvet chairs back to ensure I had a clear, unobstructed path to the altar. The angry whispers died down as I moved through the ballroom, my crimson suit radiating absolute authority and quiet menace. I did not yell back at Valerie, who was still screaming accusations. I did not engage with Jasmine, who was pathetically begging on the floor. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. My company had recently overhauled the entire technological infrastructure of this luxury resort, including the massive state-of-the-art surround sound audio system currently wired into every corner of the grand ballroom. I tapped my high-resolution screen twice, overriding the local control panel and forcing a direct administrative Bluetooth connection between my personal phone and the primary audio servers of the hotel. Valerie noticed me walking down the aisle and stepped directly into my path, trying to physically block me from reaching the altar. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred, and she opened her mouth to scream another vicious lie about my character. I did not even break my stride. I simply looked her dead in the eyes and pressed the play button on my glowing screen. I did not need to say a single word in my own defense because Jasmine was about to speak for herself. A sharp burst of digital static crackled briefly over the massive overhead speakers, instantly silencing every single person in the room. The sudden audio interruption caused everyone to freeze in place, looking up at the ceiling in total confusion. Then the vicious, aggressive, screaming voice of Jasmine echoed deafeningly through the entire grand ballroom. The high-definition audio recording from the marble restroom was absolutely crystal clear, capturing every single ounce of her malicious criminal intent. Her shrill voice blasted from the speakers telling me she did not need my dirty money. The wealthy guests gasped in collective horror as they heard the sweet demure bride transform into a ruthless, unhinged monster. The acoustics of the room amplified her terrifying rage, projecting her true personality to the very people she had tried so desperately to impress. Her recorded voice shrieked that she was marrying Connor tomorrow afternoon and would have unrestricted access to millions of dollars. Connor stood frozen at the altar, his face draining of all color as he listened to the woman he loved confess her true motives. His eyes widened in absolute shock and deep, profound betrayal. The recording continued flawlessly, broadcasting Jasmine screaming that she was transferring $200,000 from his family charity account to pay off all of her mother's secret debts the exact second the ink dried on the marriage certificate. She explicitly bragged that his billionaire family had no idea how their trust funds were structured and would never even notice the money missing until it was far too late. The sheer evil arrogance in her recorded voice was impossible to misinterpret or deny. She sounded exactly like the greedy, manipulative fraud she had always been. Every single syllable of her horrific, illegal confession bounced off the crystal chandeliers and washed over the utterly disgusted crowd. Valerie covered her mouth with her hands, stepping backward as the undeniable audio evidence destroyed any remaining shred of her credibility. Jasmine let out a piercing, terrified shriek, covering her ears, as her own voice betrayed her in front of her wealthy future in-laws. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, hiding her face in the folds of her ruined white silk dress. The billionaire parents of Connor looked physically sick, staring at the groveling woman on the altar with pure, undisguised revulsion. I tapped my screen one final time, cutting the audio playback abruptly. The sudden silence that followed the recording was incredibly heavy and absolutely deafening. There was nowhere left for them to hide, and no possible way to spin their own recorded words. The digital audit had proven the theft, and the audio recording had proven the malicious intent. The execution was completely and utterly flawless. Connor looked down at Jasmine, still kneeling on the floor in her ruined custom gown. He did not yell or express his profound heartbreak. He did not demand an explanation or wait for her to formulate another pathetic lie. He simply reached into his navy tuxedo pocket and pulled out the small velvet ring box containing the diamond wedding band. He turned to his best man standing frozen nearby and handed him the small box without speaking a single word. Connor turned his back on his weeping bride, stepped down from the floral altar, and began walking down the aisle toward the exit, leaving her entirely alone in the wreckage of her own making. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with a forceful, resounding thud that echoed loudly over the chaotic, panicked murmurs of the wealthy elite guests. I stepped slightly to the side, leaning my shoulder against the wall, allowing the undeniable force of the law to enter the opulent luxury space. 4 massive hotel security guards marched into the room, flanking 2 serious uniformed Chicago police officers. The brass badges on their dark tactical uniforms caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, signaling the absolute and immediate violent end of the lavish high society wedding. They walked down the center aisle, moving with swift professional authority directly toward the elevated floral altar. The elite venture capitalists and wealthy socialites quickly pulled their velvet chairs out of the way, parting like the Red Sea to let the determined officers pass through without any obstruction. Harrison stood near the front row, his posture rigid and his expression carved from solid, unforgiving granite. The billionaire patriarch had not hesitated for a single second after confirming the fraudulent wire transfer on his secure smartphone. He raised his hand, signaling directly to the approaching law enforcement officers. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger straight at the sobbing bride kneeling on the wooden platform and the panicked mother cowering in the front row. He informed the officers in a cold, commanding tone that a severe federal cyber theft had just been attempted against his family charitable trust. He explicitly demanded the immediate detention of both women for questioning regarding the illicit offshore accounts and the unauthorized corporate network breach. The luxurious, romantic atmosphere of the grand ballroom instantly evaporated completely, replaced by the harsh, terrifying reality of an active corporate crime scene. Jasmine realized the police were walking directly toward her, and her fragile mind completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The remaining fragments of her delicate bridal composure violently disintegrated right in front of the wealthy crowd. She tried to stand up, but her legs were shaking too severely to support her own body weight. She stumbled backward, her high heels tangling in the massive heavy layers of her custom white silk gown. The cathedral-length train snagged forcefully on the sharp edge of the wooden platform. As she thrashed wildly, trying desperately to free herself, the delicate imported lace tore with a loud, sickening rip. Her expensive custom veil caught on a protruding branch of the floral archway, snapping her head backward and pulling the ornate headpiece directly out of her styled hair. The ruined veil fluttered uselessly to the floor, leaving her looking entirely stripped of her fake angelic purity. She collapsed back onto the polished wood of the altar, screaming hysterically as the two police officers reached the front of the massive room. She knew she was facing decades in federal prison for attempting to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from one of the most powerful families in the entire Midwest. In that moment of sheer, unadulterated terror, the golden child turned violently against her own creator. Jasmine pointed a shaking, frantic finger directly at Valerie, who was currently trying to hide behind an empty velvet chair in the front row. Jasmine shrieked at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning any remaining shred of family loyalty or daughterly devotion. She wailed that she was entirely innocent, and that her mother had ruthlessly forced her to steal the charitable money. She screamed that Valerie had manipulated her, threatened her, and ordered her to hack into the secure laptop of her future husband against her will. Jasmine frantically threw her own mother directly under the bus, hoping to save herself from the impending metal handcuffs. She told the police officers that Valerie was heavily indebted to aggressive commercial loan sharks and had orchestrated the entire criminal enterprise from the very beginning. She sobbed violently, claiming she was just a terrified, helpless pawn in a massive extortion scheme designed specifically to fund the fake luxury lifestyle of her mother. The wealthy guests gasped in collective horror, watching the highly disturbing spectacle of a daughter viciously sacrificing her mother to avoid federal prosecution. The supposedly unbreakable bond of the toxic narcissistic duo dissolved instantly under the crushing pressure of undeniable accountability and severe legal consequences. Valerie heard the vicious accusations flying from the mouth of her precious golden child, and her face contorted into a mask of pure feral panic. She realized that she had entirely lost control of the fabricated narrative and that her own daughter was willingly handing her over to the authorities. The ultimate social climbing matriarch was suddenly facing the horrific, grim reality of spending her twilight years wearing a standard-issue prison uniform instead of expensive designer dresses. Her survival instincts violently kicked in, overriding any maternal instinct she might have ever possessed in her entire life. Valerie did not try to defend Jasmine or offer a comforting word to the hysterical, ruined bride. Instead, she turned around, completely abandoning her daughter on the altar, and made a desperate, pathetic dash for the side exit of the grand ballroom. She practically sprinted across the thick carpet, her counterfeit high heels sinking awkwardly into the plush fabric, slowing her momentum. She pushed blindly past the horrified socialites, knocking over a tall silver tray of champagne glasses in her frantic, desperate bid for freedom. The crystal flutes shattered loudly against the marble floor, sending sharp shards of glass flying in every possible direction. She reached out her hands, desperately grasping for the brass handle of the side door. She never even made it close. Two massive hotel security guards effortlessly stepped into her path, completely blocking her only escape route. They grabbed her arms firmly, pinning her securely in place, while the Chicago police officers approached with their metal handcuffs ready. Valerie began to thrash and wail, kicking her legs and demanding they let her go immediately. She screamed that she was a respectable woman and that her wealthy future-in-laws would have them all fired for this massive outrage. The security guards did not flinch, maintaining their iron grip on the struggling, disgraced matriarch, while the elite crowd watched her humiliating public downfall with absolute profound disgust. While the chaotic, devastating scene unfolded at the front of the room, I kept my eyes focused intently on the man sitting in the second row. David, my father, had remained completely silent throughout the entire catastrophic ordeal. He had watched Connor walk away from the altar in utter disgust. He had listened to the horrific audio recording of his youngest daughter plotting a massive federal financial crime. How was currently watching his wife fighting with security guards and his golden child screaming hysterically on the wooden floor. This was the exact same man who had stood by silently 14 years ago when Valerie pushed me out of my own college graduation photo. He had allowed me to walk out into the dark night with only $537 because he was entirely too weak to stand up to the toxic women ruining his life. Now those same toxic women were facing the absolute total destruction of their lives, and David was presented with one final opportunity to act like a real man. He could stand up, take responsibility, and try to comfort his weeping, desperate daughter. He could intervene and speak to the police officers to calm the rapidly escalating legal situation. Instead, David did exactly what he had always done when faced with uncomfortable conflict. He chose absolute pathetic cowardice over his own family. He slowly lowered his head, staring intently at the floorboards, just as he had done 14 years ago in our living room. He stood up from his velvet chair, keeping his shoulders hunched forward to avoid drawing any attention to himself. He did not look at Valerie struggling violently with the armed guards. He did not look at Jasmine sobbing uncontrollably on the ruined silk train of her wedding dress. He turned his back on his entire family and quietly slipped out through a secondary side door, completely abandoning them to their miserable self-inflicted fate. He walked away into the shadows, leaving them to drown alone in the massive, destructive flood they had created. Jasmine watched her father disappear through the side exit, and a fresh, overwhelming wave of absolute despair washed over her tear-stained face. She was entirely alone on the floral altar. Connor was gone forever. Valerie was officially detained by law enforcement. David had fled the scene in pure cowardice and shame. The billionaire family was actively pressing severe federal charges for the attempted wire fraud. She had absolutely no one left to protect her from the severe legal consequences of her massive financial theft. She slowly turned her head and looked down the long, white-carpeted aisle toward the back of the massive, luxurious ballroom. She locked her terrified eyes with me, standing calmly by the heavy oak doors, radiating pure, unbothered power and limitless, untouchable wealth. The sheer profound irony of the moment finally broke through her hysterical, panicked mind. The older sister she had mocked, bullied, and attempted to throw out of the luxury resort was now the only billionaire in the entire room capable of saving her from federal prison. Jasmine dragged herself forward, her ruined custom dress tearing even further as she crawled across the wooden platform and down the carpeted stairs. She moved with a desperate, pathetic energy, crawling on her hands and knees down the center aisle of the ballroom, while hundreds of wealthy guests watched her total degradation in stunned silence. She reached the back of the room and threw her body forward, desperately grabbing onto my ankle with her shaking, sweating hands. She looked up at me, her face completely unrecognizable beneath the smeared, expensive makeup, and frantic tears, begging me to use my massive elite status to bail her out of the catastrophic hell she had just built. Jasmine clung to my ankle with a grip fueled by absolute primal desperation. Her tears soaked directly into the hem of my tailored crimson trousers, but I did not kick her away. I did not flinch or try to pry her shaking, manicured fingers off my leg. I simply looked down at her, examining the pathetic, groveling woman she had finally become. She was babbling incoherently, begging me to use my massive corporate fortune to bribe the police officers and pay off the aggressive loan sharks currently hunting our mother. She swore through violent, heaving sobs that we were blood relatives and that sisters were supposed to protect each other in times of severe crisis. She cried that I had more than enough billions in my accounts to make this entire legal nightmare disappear with a single phone call to my lawyers. Her profound, desperate delusion was absolutely staggering to witness. She truly believed that my wealth existed solely to serve as a convenient mop to clean up the catastrophic messes caused by her own unchecked greed. The hundreds of wealthy elite guests remained completely silent, watching the stunning, unbelievable reversal of fortune play out on the marble floor of the grand ballroom. I let her weep and beg for several long, agonizing moments, allowing her total degradation to be thoroughly witnessed by the exact high society crowd she had sold her soul to impress. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of pity or anger. My face remained a perfectly calm, serene mask of cold, absolute detachment. I finally spoke with a clear, steady resonance, ensuring that my words carried effortlessly across the quiet room, reaching the ears of every single person present. 14 years ago, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a sharpened surgical blade, you and your mother stood in our living room and publicly called me ugly and worthless. You laughed with pure malicious joy while she shoved me out of my own college graduation photograph because my face was supposedly ruining your perfect luxury aesthetic. You watched me pack a single faded duffel bag and walk out the front door into the dark, humid night. I left that toxic house with exactly $537 to my name. I paused, letting the specific monetary figure sink deeply into her panicked, unhinged mind. I survived on absolutely nothing, eating cheap noodles and sleeping on floors while you were showered with expensive pageant dresses and empty praises. You thought you buried me that day, Jasmine. You thought I would just disappear and fail so you could comfortably maintain your twisted delusion of superiority. Jasmine stared up at me, her ruined, expensive makeup making her look like a terrifying clown. She shook her head frantically, trying to formulate another pathetic excuse, but I did not let her speak. I looked directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes and delivered the final, absolute death blow to her entire fabricated existence. Today, I am leaving this luxury resort with my unshakable dignity, my $40 million tech empire, and the legal deed to your mother's house. The words landed with the devastating force of a physical explosion. Jasmine stopped crying entirely, her jaw dropping open in pure, unadulterated shock. I continued, speaking, my tone completely ruthless and devoid of any mercy. I bought her severely defaulted commercial debt from the collection agency last year through an anonymous holding company. When the final payment deadline officially expired this morning, the collateral clause was automatically triggered by my legal team. Your mother does not own that sprawling brick colonial house in Atlanta anymore, Jasmine. I do. I hold the sole legal title, and I am going to bulldoze the entire property to the ground and sell the empty dirt. The sheer absolute finality of my statement completely broke whatever tiny remaining shred of sanity she possessed. Jasmine let go of my ankle and collapsed face first onto the floor, letting out a hollow, agonizing wail of total, absolute defeat. They had lost the lavish wedding, they had lost the billionaire groom, they had lost their freedom, and now they had officially lost the very roof over their heads. I had systematically and ruthlessly stripped away every single thing they valued in this world, leaving them with absolutely nothing but their own toxic, miserable reflections. Before Jasmine could attempt to reach out and grab my leg again, a tall, imposing figure stepped deliberately into my peripheral vision. It was Harrison, the billionaire patriarch of the investment fund. He walked over to where I was standing, moving with the effortless, commanding grace of a man who ruled massive global empires. He completely ignored the sobbing, ruined bride lying on the floor right next to his polished, expensive leather shoes. He literally stepped around Jasmine as if she were a discarded piece of trash that had accidentally blown into the grand ballroom. He did not spare a single passing glance for Valerie, who was currently being aggressively pinned against the wall by hotel security guards near the side exit. Harrison stopped directly in front of me and extended his right hand. His expression was no longer the polite, restrained facade of an elite socialite hosting a wedding. It was the genuine, profound respect of a ruthless, successful businessman acknowledging a true equal. He grasped my hand firmly, shaking it with deep professional admiration and unwavering gratitude. Your firm's audit saved us millions of dollars today, he announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute certainty. You exposed a massive financial vulnerability and protected our family charitable legacy from absolute vicious predators. You have our business for life, Miss Aaliyah. We will be transferring all of our cybersecurity contracts exclusively to Apex Digital by Monday morning. The public validation from the most powerful man in the room was the ultimate absolute triumph. It was the final undeniable proof that I had successfully built an untouchable reality where the pathetic opinions and malicious lies of my toxic family simply no longer mattered. I nodded gracefully, accepting his high praise and confirming that my executive cybersecurity team would be in touch to finalize the remaining security protocols. Two serious, uniformed Chicago police officers suddenly stepped forward, interrupting the quiet professional exchange. They reached down and grabbed Jasmine by the upper arms, hauling her roughly off the carpeted floor. She screamed and thrashed wildly as they aggressively secured cold metal handcuffs around her trembling wrists, forcing her arms firmly behind her back. The delicate imported silk of her custom wedding gown tore even further under the harsh physical handling. Across the sprawling ballroom, another set of officers was actively doing the exact same thing to Valerie, pulling her arms behind her back as she shrieked obscenities. The stern, authoritative voices of law enforcement began echoing clearly through the massive space. They were officially reading my mother and sister their Miranda rights, informing them of the severe federal charges they were facing regarding the attempted wire fraud and corporate cyber theft. I did not stay to watch them being dragged out of the luxury resort in heavy metal chains. The theatrical performance was officially over, and I had a highly successful tech company to run. I slowly reached up and adjusted the sharp collar of my tailored crimson jacket, smoothing the expensive fabric with my perfectly manicured hands. I turned my back completely on the chaotic, screaming wreckage of my biological family. I began walking down the long, white carpeted center aisle, moving with the exact same slow, deliberate pacing I had used when I first entered the room. The wealthy elite guests parted silently, allowing me to pass through their ranks with undisputed authority. The frantic wailing of Jasmine and the furious shouting of Valerie faded into meaningless background noise behind me. I reached the very back of the grand ballroom and pushed open the heavy oak entrance doors, stepping out into the bright, quiet hallway of the luxury hotel. I did not stop walking, and I did not look back once. Exactly 1 month passed since the catastrophic collapse of the lavish wedding. I sat perfectly relaxed in my massive leather executive chair inside the penthouse office of Apex Digital. The crisp autumn winds of Chicago whipped harmlessly against the thick reinforced glass of my floor-to-ceiling windows. The atmosphere inside my private sanctuary was entirely peaceful and completely undisturbed. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall was silently broadcasting the local financial news network. I picked up the remote control and unmuted the television, just as the morning anchor began reading the latest updates regarding a highly publicized corporate scandal. The news segment flashed a highly unflattering courtroom sketch of Jasmine across the bright screen. The anchor announced in a serious professional tone that a prominent local socialite had officially pled guilty to severe federal wire fraud charges. The elite venture capital family of Connor had aggressively pressed full criminal charges, absolutely refusing to show a single ounce of mercy to the woman who tried to embezzle from their charitable trust. The legal team representing the billionaire patriarch had ruthlessly dismantled every single pathetic defense Jasmine attempted to mount. She was facing a grueling 5-year sentence of strict federal probation, combined with hundreds of hours of mandatory community service. The terms of her release explicitly prohibited her from leaving the state or opening any commercial credit lines without direct government authorization. The broadcast then transitioned to a secondary story regarding the massive financial fallout surrounding the incident. The news anchor detailed how aggressive commercial loan sharks had rapidly descended upon an extravagant brick colonial home in Atlanta, seizing all physical assets to cover a massive defaulted business loan. Valerie had been completely and publicly evicted from the neighborhood she had spent decades desperately trying to impress. She lost her counterfeit designer handbags, her expensive furniture, and her completely fabricated high society reputation in a matter of days. I pressed the mute button on the remote control, letting the quiet serenity of my corporate office wash over me. The absolute destruction of their toxic lives was no longer a personal vendetta, but simply a matter of public record. My executive assistant walked into the expansive office carrying a heavy leather portfolio. She approached my desk with quiet professional respect and placed the thick stack of legal documents directly in front of me. I picked up my expensive silver fountain pen and opened the leather cover. Sitting on top of the stack was the official finalized foreclosure paperwork and the newly transferred property deed for the sprawling brick colonial house in Atlanta. My anonymous holding company had successfully executed the hostile takeover of the defaulted loans securing total, absolute ownership of the exact same house where I had been ruthlessly degraded 14 years ago. I stared down at the crisp white legal paper bearing the official state seals and the unmistakable address of my childhood trauma. I did not feel a single drop of nostalgic sorrow or lingering anger. I felt nothing but cold, unbothered administrative closure. I did not plan to sell the massive house to turn a petty profit. I certainly did not plan to ever step foot inside that toxic, suffocating environment again. I flipped to the second page of the legal portfolio, which outlined a highly detailed property transfer agreement drafted specifically by my corporate legal team. I firmly pressed the tip of my fountain pen against the paper and signed my name with fluid, decisive strokes. With one single signature, I officially donated the entire sprawling property and all surrounding land to a highly respected national nonprofit organization. The charity specialized exclusively in providing secure housing, advanced education, and comprehensive technical training for young displaced women who had been thrown out of abusive, toxic homes. I explicitly attached a massive anonymous corporate grant from Apex Digital to completely fund the immediate demolition and intense renovation of the interior structure. I wrote strict, detailed instructions for the architectural demolition team. I commanded them to completely tear down the lavish vanity room where Valerie used to hoard her expensive pageant dresses and superficial cosmetics. I ordered them to convert that specific space into a state-of-the-art digital computer lab equipped with the most advanced programming software available on the market. I wanted the exact physical space that had once been dedicated to shallow, toxic vanity to be violently transformed into a powerful incubator for brilliant young female minds. I signed the final authorization page and handed the thick leather portfolio back to my assistant. She nodded respectfully and silently left the room to execute the massive charitable transfer. The house of Valerie was officially gone forever, permanently replaced by a sanctuary that would actively build up the exact same kind of intelligent, unconventional women my mother had always deeply despised. I pushed my heavy chair back from the mahogany desk and stood up, smoothing the dark fabric of my tailored suit. I walked slowly across the imported hardwood floor, moving away from the glowing computer monitors and the endless streams of corporate data. I approached a sleek, illuminated marble pedestal, standing quietly in the far corner of my executive office. Resting securely on top of the solid marble block was a small custom-built display case made of thick, protective glass. I stood perfectly still, looking down through the clear glass at the object resting inside. It was not a prestigious corporate award or a shiny plaque celebrating my $40 million net worth. It was simply a single worn, faded, crisp $1 bill. The corners of the green paper were slightly frayed, and the serial numbers were somewhat faded from years of rough handling. That specific piece of frayed paper currency was the very first dollar I had ever earned working grueling double shifts at a greasy diner in Atlanta. It was the absolute foundational cornerstone of the $537 I had frantically shoved into a faded duffel bag on the humid night I walked out of my miserable family home. I had kept that exact dollar bill securely hidden in my wallet through every single terrifying night I spent sleeping on unfamiliar couches, and through every agonizing week I survived eating cheap instant noodles. It served as a constant, quiet reminder of the burning, desperate vow I made to myself while walking 3 miles down a dark concrete highway. I looked at the faded green ink and felt a profound, overwhelming surge of pride radiating through my entire chest. That single isolated dollar was the undeniable genesis of my entire massive corporate empire. I lifted my gaze away from the glass display case and looked directly out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sprawling, magnificent metropolis of Chicago stretched out endlessly before me, filled with towering skyscrapers and bustling financial districts. My company actively secured the digital infrastructure running through the very veins of this massive city. I watched the busy traffic moving silently on the streets far below, completely insulated from the noise and chaos of the outside world. The realization washed over me like a warm, healing wave. True ultimate revenge was never actually about destroying Valerie and Jasmine. The aggressive foreclosure and the severe criminal charges were simply the natural, unavoidable consequences of their own malicious greed and blinding stupidity. They had essentially destroyed themselves the exact second they tried to outsmart a woman who had spent 14 years mastering the ruthless art of absolute survival. The actual sweet, profound revenge was the majestic, untouchable reality I had meticulously built for myself. It was the fact that their petty, toxic opinions, their fabricated high society lies, and their very miserable existence simply no longer mattered to me in any capacity whatsoever. They were permanently locked away in a chaotic, ruined past, while I commanded a brilliant, limitless future. I did not need their approval, and I certainly did not need their love to feel entirely complete. I turned my back to the window and walked confidently back toward my massive mahogany desk. I picked up my warm espresso cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the rich, dark coffee. I sat back down in my executive chair, pulling up the latest quarterly projections for Apex Digital. I had a $40 million tech empire to run, and absolutely nothing was ever going to stand in my way again. The ultimate revenge was simply breathing, living, and thriving in a state of absolute, unbothered success. The ultimate lesson from Aaliyah's journey is that true success is the best revenge. Instead of wasting energy on anger or seeking validation from those who belittle you, focus entirely on building your own empire. Aaliyah turned her pain into power, proving that dignity, self-reliance, and professional excellence create an armor that toxicity cannot penetrate. When you stop chasing the approval of people who thrive on your downfall, you reclaim your autonomy. Adversity does not define you. Your response to it does. By mastering your craft and maintaining integrity, you become untouchable, and your growth naturally exposes the flaws of those who tried to hold you back. Start building your own legacy today by investing in your skills. What's one project you can start right now that moves you closer to your goals?